This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman
and Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod. All right, we've got some sponsors for the pod now.
Wait, what?
Every link you need for the things we talk about here is at artofdarkpod.com/sponsors. First up, books.
If you're into this podcast, odds are you're probably a reader. We've got links to buy new books from bookshop.org and used books from alibris.com.
And if you want to listen to your books, we recommend and use audible.com.
It's great, and the catalog is huge.
All right. So if you're listening to this, you are online.
Maybe you're very online.
You probably have a website or are thinking of starting one. Maybe you want a website like artofdarkpod.com. We built that with WordPress, which is by far the most popular way to create websites. And the single best host for serious WordPress is WP Engine. I've personally used them for over a decade now, and I don't host my websites anywhere else. Go to artofdarkpod.com/sponsors and click on the WP Engine link to learn more.
Finally, the best way to support the show is at patreon.com/artofdarkpod. Get the bonus After Dark content for every episode, access to the book club, and more.
Thanks for supporting Art of Darkness.
Here we get the first instantiation of a cycle that happens several times for Poe. He gets an editing job. He's actually really, really good at it. His boss thinks he's talented. He's making big contributions, including actual pieces of his own writing. But like every other one, he's underpaid. He eventually becomes difficult to deal with. He becomes erratic, and one might say even wayward.
Okay, our favorite word here. Yeah, we got it. I'm really glad. That's my new favorite word.
It's a good word. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now
I really am. I'm feeling like a future merch opportunity.
Yeah.
We do have a little bit. You go to the website, artofdarkpod.com. Mm-hmm. There's a link to a bonfire. I'm feeling like we need a Become Wayward shirt or mug.
That. I like that.
Good one. It's a keeper.
Yeah. Now, whenever he had these issues at these journals, there was always a sort of the general cause is that he's Edgar Allan Poe, but there's always a sort of approximate cause. Like, what's the kickoff of the thing, right? He's doing well. He's publishing articles, blah, 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 blah. Now, this time, he makes this move from Baltimore to Richmond. It's still fairly on in his relationship with his aunt Maria Clem and Maria's daughter, Poe's cousin, Virginia. And so he's left them behind. He's sending them some money, but he's left them behind in Baltimore. And it turns out that Poe's cousin, Nielsen Poe, is starting to make advances to Aunt Maria and Virginia and saying, you should just come live with me. I'll take care of you. And this enrages Edgar because Edgar seemed to want to eventually marry Virginia, his cousin. She's like 13 at this time, but I think the idea is like eventually they would get married, right? Okay. Now, there's been some scholarly debate about this, and we're going to get into it eventually here. But let me tell you, this is from Thomas Willis White. And so
smashing the age gap button.
Oh yeah. So Poe's getting all distressed about the situation going up. Basically, I might lose Virginia, right?
Right.
This prospect, this woman that I might eventually want to marry.
Well, and it might have also offended his sensibility of like, as a man, like this is my unit and you're interjecting.
I think that's part of it too. I think it's like, I'm sending money back. I'm trying to build something here. I'm going to take care of these people. They took me in, and I'm going to, I think that's the most charitable version of this, but it certainly bothered him and preoccupied him and stressed him out that this was going on back up in Baltimore. let's let me read this little bit. This is about his boss responding to this. White, that's his boss, told Lucian Minor, a temperance advocate and frequent contributor to the Southern Literary Messenger, that's the magazine Poe worked on, that drink and depression had driven the unstable young man to the verge of suicide. Quote, Poe is now in my employ, not as editor. He is unfortunately rather dissipated, and therefore I can place very little reliance upon him. His disposition is quite amiable. He will become some assistance to me in proofreading. But Poe has flew the track already. His habits were not good. He is in addition the victim of melancholy. I should not be at all astonished to hear that he has been guilty of suicide. This letter may have in fact started the rumor in the literary world that Poe was not quite sane.
Eesh. Oof.
So
yeah, that's tough. You're trying to employ this kid, and it's like you're basically saying he's erratic, he's depressed, he's got bad habits. We know what that means,
right?
And he's a lot to deal with. But he has potential.
Yeah, he's good. He's talented. He's smart, and when he's not drunk, he's like a reasonable guy. Yeah. And people would often talk about how he was like a Southern gentleman, or at least posed himself as that. So if you caught him on a day when he was not in some strange mood or intoxicated or coming off a bender, he would be a very reasonable person. People would say he was very good in conversation. He seemed like he was really listening to you, and he always had something to contribute. There's
and a man of letters,
yes,
an educated man.
Yeah. Right. Now he does. So Thomas Willis White fires him and then hires him back. And then Poe begs to get the job back, and he gets hired back. He apparently went sober for a while. And then Poe, in this second round, convinces the Clems to come down to Richmond. So he moves Aunt Maria and Virginia down to Richmond, where he's going to be their financial support. And like happens in many men, the burden of responsibility sharpens him up. Right. The fact that it's like, it's on you now, buddy. Like he gets himself together a bit. By early 1836, he is the capital E editor of the Southern Literary Messenger. He's he's not the owner, but he's the top dog. Okay. Now, Poe the editor. For many people in Poe's time, if you knew who Poe was, you would know him as an editor and a critic. That's how you would know him. Some people would know him as a poet. Some people would know him as an editor and critic. Some people would know him as a short story writer. Some people, of course, all of these things combined. Poe would become, as a critic, practically a household name, at least in literary households. If you got books on the shelf, you probably are familiar with Poe's reviews of this or that. Though, much of so he's cranking out stuff for the Messenger, the Southern Literary Messenger, and a lot of it is sort of rushed out. It doesn't always, show how brilliant he is. At the same time, apparently during this time, he was working all day in the library and deliberately using the work he was doing for the Southern Literary Messenger to expand his erudition. He's like, I am going to learn as much as I can in order to write this review. I'm going to read this book, that book, and this book, and I'm going to use this as a template, as a springboard to get smarter. Right?
Yeah. I will say it's one of the perks of doing Art of Darkness.
Oh, yeah.
Not that we're editors of a fancy magazine or anything, but one of the perks of this show is I can't say how often it comes up naturally in conversation. Someone mentions a figure and you go, oh, you try to not be insufferable about it. But it's an interesting thing about doing this show. Yeah. This is maybe a good life hack, right? Yeah. Like if you're in a position in a job to gobble up knowledge on the job and get paid to do it.
Yeah. Use that to ratchet the two up, because it made him a better critic too. Right. But it also turned into, you read a book and for the rest of your life, you've read it. So yeah. Now he uses his position here in 1836 to publish a play he'd written called Politan or Politan?
Peloton?
Not Peloton. Politan. Politan. Whatever. Huh. It's about an actual murder that happened down in Kentucky that had become something of a legend. As a play, it did not engender much enthusiasm, unfortunately. But he starts to publish.
I would say Politian or Politian.
But it's just TAN.
No, I'm seeing. I looked it up. You might have a typo. I looked it up.
Possible,
it's Politian. So
Politian.
Yeah.
You got it.
Okay.
I just missed a keystroke, I think.
That's all right.
Okay, so he starts to he's using this also not only to expand his erudition, but he's using it as an opportunity to put his own stories in. You're the editor. It is your job to fill space in the magazine, right?
You got to sell those ads.
That's right. And so, if why can't it be you, right?
There's this novel called Nutcracker by a fellow named Dan Baltic, and I really think people are going to love it. Show's lawyer, by the way.
That's right. That's right. Now let me read you a little bit of
he starts publishing himself, and he's the editor, and does he do it under his own name? He's just like cool.
And people like it. People like it. That's the other thing. Like it works.
I'm so happy. I'm so happy for him. I'm so happy that he got to this point.
Yeah. Now let me read you from one of the stories he published in the Southern Literary Messenger in the I think this is 1837, possibly. This is a story called Berenice. He has a number of short stories that are just the titles of them are the names of women. This one is Berenice. Quote. Berenice and I were cousins, and we grew up together in my paternal halls. Yet differently we grew. I, ill of health and buried in gloom. She, agile, graceful, and overflowing with energy. Hers the ramble on the hillside, mine the studies of the cloister. I, living within my own heart and addicted, body and soul, to the most intense and painful meditation. She, roaming carelessly through life with no thought of the shadows in her path or the silent flight of the raven-winged hours. Berenice! I call upon her name, Berenice, and from the gray ruins of memory, 1,000 tumultuous recollections are startled at the sound. Vividly is her image before me now, as in the early days of her lightheartedness and joy. Oh, gorgeous yet fantastic beauty. Oh, sylph amid the shrubberies of Arnheim. Oh, naiad among its fountains. And then all is mystery and terror and a tale which should not be told. Disease, a fatal disease, fell like the simoon upon her frame. And even while I gazed upon her, the spirit of change swept over her, pervading her habits and her character, and in a manner the most subtle and terrible, disturbing even the identity of her person. Alas, the destroyer came and went, and the victim, where is she? I know her not, or knew her no longer as Berenice. Now, this is a story, I'll give you a spoiler alert. This is a story where we see Poe reaching out past simple Gothic supernatural into full-on horror. And Berenice, I'm not going to read the whole thing. The narrator has this thing where he becomes incredibly fixated on things. That's like his pathology. He becomes like, he'll just like stare at a thing for hours on end. And at one point he gets obsessed with Berenice's teeth. He's just staring at them, staring at them. And then Berenice dies and she's buried. And overnight, somebody robs the grave, and our narrator is sitting in bed, and the housemaid or whatever comes to alert him that the grave has been robbed. And it turns out that in like a fugue state, he has robbed her grave and taken her teeth out of her head.
Oh, damn.
Yeah. It's intense.
Whoa, that is dark, man.
It's super dark. Yes. Yeah. And he didn't like, and so you've got all these sort of
and is he
he's
confessing it in the narration?
Or yes, he gets caught at the end. Like he comes to the realization that he did it. Like he didn't even know he was doing it, right? So you've got this like he's like deranged in a fugue state when he went and did it. It's good. It's very effective and unsettling, and
it's like a weird fetishistic kind of.
And so it's gory, and like the idea of taking the teeth out of a dead person. It's all pretty intense.
And if you, as a person, if you become acutely aware of your own teeth, have you ever done that where you sort of fixate on it? You go, I got bones in my face.
Right.
Like it's uncanny. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Have you ever had the dream of your teeth are falling out?
Oh, dude, yeah, grinding and everything. Oh, it's so painful. Yeah.
Well, no, I've dreamed where I've like looked in the mirror and I like,
and my
teeth are falling out. Oh, yeah. Anyway, So a very effective story. And like I said, moving just past just the wispy, ghostly romances of Gothic and adding this other like physically disturbing element, right? Now, a story he writes after this typifies another genre that Poe worked in and frankly innovated within profoundly. This is a story called Hans Pfaall, Hans Pfaall, I think.
Hans Pfaall. Yeah.
Pfaall. So the full title of it is The Unparalleled Adventure of One Hans Pfaall.
Pfaall.
And this is a story that capitalizes on the interest in the balloon, like the hot air balloon. The balloon had been invented in the late 1700s, right? So this is only like 30 or 40 years later. The balloon and Poe would have 3 different prominent stories featuring balloons. This balloon ends up on the moon. It's a moon balloon. Myers, I did read it. It's pretty good. It's not my favorite. Jeffrey Myers describes it as having all the reality of Daniel Defoe, all the weirdness of E.T.A. Hoffman, and a demonstrable introduction of scientific and technological knowledge into fiction. If one were to trace the origins, the history of science fiction, it's not that Poe's story starts it, but it is an important waypoint on the, like, Jules Verne had read this story, right? Who's the other big science fiction writer of that day? I'm just blanking on his name. H.G. Wells had read this story.
You
right?
got it.
Yeah. So this is an important story if you want to understand the lineage of science fiction. And Poe would have other stories that were science fiction. And there's nothing horrific about it. There's nothing gothic about it. You would recognize it as a science fiction story just before we have a lot of the technology that we have now. It has all that gee whiz vibe to it.
Yeah, I like this idea. We're going to take a balloon to the moon.
Right,
we're going to space.
Right, and they encounter creatures there, and it's a whole
fun
thing.
Yeah. It's a Smashing Pumpkins video now.
Exactly. I totally thought about that when I was reading it. Now, while Poe is working in the Southern Literary Messenger in the 1830s, he's an editor, and so he becomes something of a public intellectual. So let's look a moment at his some of the other things that he did. This is from the Jeffrey Myers biography, quote, he introduced a series of articles on, quote, autography, which discussed how handwriting revealed character, included physical descriptions of the authors who sent in their signatures, and indulged in a bit of literary gossip. W.H. Auden later expressed a commonly held view of Poe's literary journalism by stating that much of his best criticism will never be read widely because it lies buried in reviews of totally uninteresting authors. So, like, there are literally reviews he wrote that are more noteworthy than the books they are reviewing, right?
Criticism is an art.
It is. When it's well done, it certainly is. Yeah,
for sure. I was a little being jokey, a little and harsh earlier. But it is also it tends to be on the receiving side of public criticism, especially when you can't shoot back. It's a very heavy part of modern life.
Mm-hmm. Continuing on here. Yet the 94 pieces he wrote from December 1835 to August 1836 on philosophy, science, romance, poetry, travel, navigation, physiology, and law include many works by the leading authors of his time, Irving, Cooper, and Bryant, among the older generation of American writers, Godwin, Coleridge, Southey, Hazlitt, Francis Trollope, and Bulwer Lytton among his English contemporaries, right? So, let me think about. Oh, yes. Here's the other thing. So he develops this. He over time he develops this reputation as sort of rapier-witted. Like he's. Some people describe his critical pen as a tomahawk. Like they'll say, Poe really tomahawked. Did you read that new review of Poe? Poe wrote on whatever book came out. He really tomahawked them. He was happy to go for the jugular. Yes. Now, let me read a little bit about. Oh, here's a couple harsh reviews he wrote, just snippets of really harsh reviews he wrote. And I'm going to have titles of books in here that people probably don't know these books. Here's one quote: "The Swiss Heiress should be read by all who have nothing better to do."
Banger.
Another one,
banger.
he says, quote, "Ups and Downs," that's the name of the book, "is a public imposition. It should have been printed among the quack advertisements." Here's another one about Paul Ehrlich is too, that's the name of the book, is too purely imbecile to merit an extended critique. As one of the class of absurdities with an inundation of which our country is grievously threatened, we shall have no hesitation and shall spare no pains in exposing fully before the public eye its 443 pages of utter folly, bombast, and inanity. Such are the works which bring daily discredit upon our national literature.
Damn.
Tough crowd. Poe is a tough crowd.
Woo!
Now, it wasn't just sort of trashy novels. I mean, it could be one thing, you know, he's just reviewing the bottom of the barrel. It wasn't just that. He would make a number of enemies and sour relationships with many writers even writers he respected at one time or another. He's, like we said before, he strongly disliked the transcendentalists. Of Ralph Waldo Emerson, he once said the man was, quote, "a mystic for mysticism's sake." And Poe generally just hated their poetry, not to mention their philosophy. Poe would say of James Fenimore Cooper that Cooper couldn't write characters. And when Nathaniel Hawthorne's Mosses from an Old Manse came out, and he'd previously liked Hawthorne and thought Hawthorne was the preeminent American writer, Poe called Hawthorne at this time, when Mosses from an Old Manse came out, Poe said that Hawthorne was peculiar and not original. So that's tough.
And he did all this in writing.
Yeah. This isn't just like talking to your friends or whatever. This is in review.
I mean, and let's be real. The American, literary scene has always been entirely dominated by that corridor of the Northeast, and it still is to this day. Anybody will tell you that.
Yeah.
And obviously, it's changed an awful lot, but you're still in conversation with that megalopolis out west or out east from Boston all the way down to DC, and you're not going to be making any friends by by putting this stuff in circulation. Yeah.
Well, and then you're trying to make it's you don't have to suck up to these people like Hawthorne, but it's better to just not make an enemy of him if you're trying to have your own career as a writer, right? Just maybe just don't review that. I don't know.
Sure. And then, it's also a bit of a who do you think you are? And we happen to know in hindsight that he could back it up, but they didn't know that at the time.
Right.
Yeah.
An interesting note too, and I think we may have mentioned it in the intro. Poe was obsessed with and paranoid about plagiarism. He pounced on even the faintest whiff of a borrowed idea in another person's work. And if anybody accused him, he was just aghast. I think, and if you read it, I read the majority of his short stories now at this point, and there are a lot of them. He's constantly borrowing elements from himself. I think his obsession about plagiarism is actually a little bit of like feeling insecure about it. It's the anxiety of influence. I think it's like, I'm stealing and borrowing stuff all the time. I'm going to pounce on it when other people do it. And if anybody accuses me of it, I'm going to freak out. Right. Because
I wonder too, how much of it is like him. He obviously takes this seriously. This is kind of the only thing he has.
It is. Yep.
Yeah.
He's hanging on by a thread, and he's not making a lot of money. He's making enough money to eat, sort of, right? It's not, and he's got his aunt and his young cousin to take care of as well. Now, but as I said, he's doing fairly well. I mean, he's sharpened himself up after this. He got quit and he begged for his job back. On May 16th, 1836, Poe, at the age of 27, marries his nearly 14-year-old cousin, Virginia. I'm going to give you a quick description of her.
That is one of the all-time Art of Darkness age gaps that we've had. That is a heavy duty, very alienating. What do you say? Different times, but
yeah,
that's freaking wild.
Right. I
and
totally, I
his
agree.
own cousin.
Yeah. Yeah. It's pretty intense. Okay, here I'm going to give you a description of her from the Jeffrey Myers biography. Quote, even as an adult, she was fair, soft, and graceful and girlish. Everyone who saw her was won by her. Poe was very proud and very fond of her and used to delight in the round, childlike face and plump little figure, which he contrasted with himself, so thin and half melancholy looking. And she in turn idolized him. She had a voice of wonderful sweetness and was an exquisite singer. And in some of their more prosperous days, when they were living in a pretty little rose-covered cottage, she had her harp and piano. At home, the character of Edgar Poe appeared in its most beautiful light. Playful, affectionate, witty, alternately docile and wayward as a petted child for his young, gentle, and idolized wife, and for all who came, he had even in the midst of his most harassing literary duties a kind word, a pleasant smile, a graceful and courteous attention. So they love each other. I think there's some debate about whether he married her initially to sort of take care of her. I don't know that he would have to marry her necessarily, but it does keep other dudes away, right? He did have
There's a sort of similar thing with Marilyn all those
yeah,
years later. Yeah.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's
And
generally
when I say Marilyn on this podcast, you know the Marilyn I'm talking about.
right.
I would hope. Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
Go back and listen to the Marilyn Monroe episode for sure. It's a banger. Now we say, oh, it's a different time, so this age gap wasn't that big of a deal. Well, he had a witness testify or whatever to the church that she was 21.
Okay. I never said it was not a big deal, by the way.
No. I'm not saying you did.
Yeah.
I'm just like, we think back, we're like, well, maybe that's what they did back then. It's
Right.
not really.
Yeah. It doesn't, I don't think so. Yeah.
Right. Now, however the relationship started, it may not have started sexually. That nobody knows for sure. Later on, he would refer to her as sis or sister. It's generally agreed now that it at least eventually became a sexual relationship. But let's read another poem. This is the last poem he wrote, and this is believed to be.
Thank God.
Yeah, this is believed to be about Virginia. This is the poem that Nabokov took the working title of Lolita from. It's a poem called.
Well, that would make sense, wouldn't it?
It would, right? It's a poem called Annabel Lee, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's got a lovely little lilt or something to it. Quote, it was many and many a year ago in a kingdom by the sea that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child, and she was a child in this kingdom by the sea, but we loved with a love that was more than love. I and my Annabel Lee, with a love that the winged seraph of heaven coveted her and me. And this was the reason that, long ago, in this kingdom by the sea, a wind blew out of a cloud, chilling my beautiful Annabel Lee, so that her highborn kinsman came and bore her away from me to shut her up in the sepulchre in this kingdom by the sea. The angels, not half so happy in heaven, went envying her and me. Yes, that was the reason, as all men know, in this kingdom by the sea, that the wind came out of the cloud by night, chilling and killing my Annabel Lee. But our love, it was stronger by far than the love of those who were older than we, of many far wiser than we, and neither the angels in heaven above nor the demons down under the sea can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee. For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee, and the stars never rise but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And so all the night tide I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in the sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the sounding sea. Okay, so that's the last poem he ever wrote. It comes much later in the story than we are right now, but that was his poem. Virginia dies before he does, and that was his poem, sort of in honor of her. Okay,
and you can get the motif of obsession, a fixation, the fixation on the name. I think anybody who's been in love, you can maybe relate to that idea of the name coming to, it symbolizes something.
Yeah, absolutely. So now he gets married. The job is going fairly well. Something's going to go wrong. What goes wrong?
This is Art of Darkness. Something has to go wrong.
Yeah. Here's what goes wrong. Once again, it's booze. Let me read this bit from the biography. Yeah. So, this is just generally and then more specific. Poe was the kind of alcoholic who could abstain for months at a time and then suddenly lose control, start to drink excessively, and continue to do so for days at a time. He would, as he tried to explain to a potential patron with more optimism than truth, quote, "Intemperance with me has never amounted to a habit, and had it been 10 times a habit, it would have required scarcely an effort on my part to shake it from me at once and forever." Now, a little bit further down. Alcoholism in Poe's time, when churches and temperance units exerted a powerful influence on society, was considered as morally reprehensible as drug addiction is today. It was thought of as a moral defect rather than a psychological affliction, and few people were as sympathetic and tolerant as White. That's Poe's boss, was Thomas Willis White. Drink brought out the split in Poe's personality. It reversed his normal nature and transformed the courtly gentleman into a frenzied beast. All his friends agreed that a single glass of wine, to most men a moderate stimulus, turned him into a madman. He drank to excess, became coarse and vulgar, fell into fits of the deepest gloom, and finally became so sick that he could not drink anymore. These drinking bouts were always followed by several days of sickness. John Daniel, a Richmond editor, described Poe's drinking as a joyless and compulsive self-destruction. Quote, "His taste for drink was a simple disease, no source of pleasure or excitement. When the poison had passed his lips, he would go at once to a bar and drink off glass after glass as fast as its titular genius could mix them, until his faculties were utterly swallowed up." Okay. Now, basically, he drinks his way out of this job, ends up getting fired. We're not going to go into all the details. There's a lot of magazine jobs that he has. He loses basically all of them. We're not going to necessarily track the vicissitudes of each one. The pattern is very much the same from one to the next. Now, one thing we should say is, though, his work expanded the distribution of the Southern Literary Messenger quite significantly. And he just made his same basic wage, no matter how much better. You know, it's like, we'll get to figures on a later magazine he works on, where it's like you'll see it's a little egregious, like how underpaid he was for how much work he was doing and how successful it was. Yeah. Now, so after he leaves Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond, Virginia, and he decides that he's going to try New York. But he lands there amidst the Panic of 1837. The Panic of 1837 was one of the largest depressions in U.S. history.
I like how you could throw a dart at a calendar just for past 200 years. And odds are like 1 in 7 you're going to hit the year of or right. It's almost like our system creates booms and busts.
Yeah.
And that it's planned and coordinated. And people who are behind it sell the top and buy the bottom. But let's just forget about any of that. Yeah. Okay. No worries.
Right. No,
it's whole lives could it's just normal. This is just economics.
It's completely random. Nobody could foresee it.
Obviously. Yeah. It's a feature, not a bug.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It is so funny though, because every single crash you read about, it's like the greatest. Right. It's never like a mild crash when you read about it.
Right. It's like suddenly everyone forgot what money was, and there was no right.
The Bojangles crash of 1943 when you're like, what are you talking about? There was just a crash in the anyway.
Right.
So we're literally gonna live through. If we live to be 80, we're gonna live through like 10 of these.
I've been through a handful.
Yeah, we've been through a few already. Yeah. What if we turn our homes into banks?
That's a great idea.
We turn our homes into giant credit cards. Let's do that. Yeah, what could go wrong?
So he can't make a living in New York, 1837. He goes to Philadelphia, 1838, and becomes acquainted with some writers there. One of them is this guy, Thomas Dunn English. We're going to talk more about Thomas Dunn English in the After Dark, patreon.com/artofdarkpod, where we learn what got Poe booted out of the what made it so he was no longer the literary it girl of New York City, and it involves Thomas Dunn English. That's the story for our patrons only, though.
For Patreon.
Yeah. Now, once he gets to Philadelphia, he does have a reputation as a writer. I mean, he's done well with the Southern Literary Messenger. It's not the biggest newspaper in the world, but you have to remember, people of any literate people would be subscribed, who, if they had any money, would be subscribed to perhaps 3, 4, 5, 6 of these different magazines. You didn't have TV, you didn't have radio. Most people weren't buying a lot of books, even. Like, this is pretty much the media that you consumed, was these magazines.
So, yeah, and they would probably change hands too. I've read this one, and you get it, and
sure. And and also newspapers, normal newspapers, would have literary elements to them too. They'd have poems and stories and things like that, and then you'd have more literary compendiums that were like, and then of course there were anthologies, all of this. So Poe is sort of known. He wasn't as famous as like Emerson or Longfellow by any stretch of the imagination, but he was well known enough that other writers who were successful thought of him as an equal. Guys like James Kirk Paulding, who people we don't know now necessarily, but Thomas Chovens. He had kind of a following. People knew who Poe was. So he tries to get a collection of short stories published in a volume through Harper's, and Harper's basically tells him, look, people don't want a collection of short stories. They want a novel, basically. Okay. They'll tell you the same thing now. Is whether it's true or not, who even knows anymore, right? Apparently they want somebody who can throw a good party. This is what I mean.
They want a book that you can pose with.
Right. Right. So 1838, Poe completes and publishes his only novel-length book. It's actually pretty short. It's less than 200 pages, called The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. I want to read you the full subtitle of this book that it was published under, because it's ridiculous. All right, so 1 second. Sorry, I picked up the wrong book there. I do really like this book, though. Like, if you're looking for something that's a little bit longer to read from Poe, and maybe isn't so much of the horror stuff, though there's plenty of horror in it, Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym is great. But let me read you the subtitle. It's so funny. The narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, comprising the details of a mutiny and atrocious butchery on board the American brig Grampus on her way to the South Sea in the month of June 1827, with an account of the recapture of the vessel by the survivors, their shipwreck and subsequent horrible sufferings from famine, their deliverance by means of the British schooner Jane Guy, the brief cruise of this latter vessel into the Antarctic Ocean, her capture, and the massacre of her crew among a group of islands in the 84th parallel of southern latitude, together with the incredible adventures and discoveries still farther south to which that distressing calamity gave rise. That's the subtitle. He just tells you it's literally everything that happens in the book, every major plot point.
It would be so funny to memorize that as like a party trick or
right. Have you be like, have you read and just like reel it off. Somebody asked for like a book recommendation. Like, you read anything good lately? Yeah, I just finished
Edgar Allan Poe's. I just, without missing a beat, just go so hard.
You're just talking for literally 45 seconds straight.
And that is how you get kicked out of the Manhattan literary scene.
That's right. I really recommend this story. There's so much going on. It's very episodic. It's the seafaring story primarily. And the level of technical details in here exceeds Conrad. And I'm not saying that Poe understood sailing more than Conrad did, because Poe didn't have a lot of substantial experience as a sailor, but Poe loved technical details. He would have loved escape rooms. He loved puzzles. We're going to talk later about how he loved cryptography and riddles. So it's not surprising that he basically throws his character into an impossible situation, and then sort of you along with Poe figure out how you're going to get out of it. So it's pretty fun when it's well done.
I like the idea of Poe maybe had a couple of glasses of wine in an escape room in Cleveland,
Yeah.
circa now.
Right. You let me out of here, you demonic. Yeah. He gets trapped.
He can't get any of the references. Everything's too modern.
That's right.
It's very funny. Yeah.
Some other things that are really good about this book are he's really good at expressing the effects of like the physical body and extremists, because like the characters practically starve to death. They actually have, and it's unsettling scene. They have a bit where there's 4 of them left or 5 of them left, and they're starving to death. And they decide that one of them, they got to draw straws, and whoever loses is going to get eaten. And like the tension and the difficulty of it, it's great. It's very well done. And so, like I say, it gets dark. Like they're literally eating each other. It's pretty wild. Now the novel comes out. First 2 parts of it come out in the Literary Messenger. He basically never finishes it, which is the ending is. We'll talk about the ending in a second. One thing I want to point out though. A lot of the book takes place, maybe the last third or so of the book takes place in Antarctica or Antarctic waters. And it's really important to think this book was published in 1838. Antarctica was discovered in 1820. Nobody knew what the hell was going on down there. Right. Like, and when they discovered it, it's literally like they saw it over there. They didn't, and it's a huge landmass. So nobody knew anything about what it was.
It's the great ice wall that hides Agartha.
Right. Now whatever. modern science knows
we know that that's the ice wall behind which they hide the spacecraft.
Yeah.
The rockets that work are behind the ice wall.
But at that time, they didn't have this advanced level of research that we've been able to do since. There's something kind of cool about like he's filling in this blank spot on the map. He makes it up. He invents a civilization that lives down there. Yeah.
Lovecraftian.
It's very
Lovecraft. Lovecraft.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Our friend Ben Thomas, who helped us out with the Lovecraft episode, he refers to this as pre At the Mountains of Madness. This story, the Gordon Pym novel. It's kind of. I had trouble deciding. I definitely wanted to read some parts of it, but it's kind of tricky to decide which. I'm going to read this. So part of it, what happens is Pym. Well, the first thing that happens, Pym and his buddy, they go out drunken boating in the middle of the night, and they get run over and nearly killed on the like off of Nantucket. Then he decides that he wants to become a sailor and go out on a seafaring adventure. Pym does, but he knows his father won't let him, so he becomes a stowaway so that he'll come out when the ship is way at sea and nothing can be done about it. He's like already at sea. They can't turn around and go back or whatever. But when he's down there in the hold, pirates take over the ship and kill almost everyone, and he's like locked down in the hold, and he only gets out by like a complex set of puzzle solving. It's pretty good actually, but everybody's been slaughtered, and like some of it's depicted like just flat on the page. It's not even hidden. It's just we're murdering these people and throwing them over the side.
It's the fun fact, he was only able to get out by doing his best Keith Richards impression.
Weird.
That's the only way the pirates would let him out.
That's like Jack Sparrow.
No, this sounds fascinating. This novel. Yeah.
It's a cool book. It's very pulpy, but sort of, but also, yeah.
It feels like he's going after money with this. He's like this. I am a serious writer. I am having a career, and I'm gonna move some copies. I honestly, I can't give you a good reason why it didn't. To be honest, like there's no obvious. It's not too heady. It's not too cerebral or anything. Like it feels like it wasn't a big success.
It wasn't. No, it sold very few copies.
Probably he alienated some people. Possibly.
It's probably. Yeah. Now, I'm going to read a bit. This is basically after the worst of it's happened. So the bandits have killed most of the original crew. Pime has broken out. He and a buddy and somebody they managed to turn over from the old crew have killed everybody else, have killed all the pirates, right? It's murder, murder, murder. And then they get smashed by a squall, so the boat's no longer navigable. They're just floating around. They don't have any way to actually sail. They're just on a big piece of wood. He keeps referring to it as the Hulk because it's just like the last bit that hasn't sunk, basically. And they're starving. This is as bad as it gets. I think at this point they've already elected to cannibalize one of the people. I think happened before this bit I'm going to read. So let me just give you a quote so you get a sense of what this is like. Quote, "My principal terror was now on account of the sharks, which I knew to be in my vicinity. In order to deter these, if possible, from approaching me, I splashed the water vigorously with both hands and feet as I swam toward the hulk, creating a body of foam. I have no doubt that to this expedient, simple as it was, I was indebted for my preservation. For the sea all around the brig, just before her rolling over, was so crowded with these monsters that I must have been, and really was, in actual contact with some of them during my progress. By great good fortune, however, I reached the side of the vessel in safety, although so utterly weakened by the violent exertion I had used that I should have never been able to get upon it but for the timely assistance of Peters, who now, to my great joy, made his appearance and threw me the end of a rope, one of those which had been attached to the spikes. Having barely escaped this danger, our attention was now directed to the dreadful imminency of another, that of absolute starvation. Our whole stock of provision had been swept overboard in spite of all our care in securing it, and seeing no longer the remotest possibility of obtaining more, we gave way, both of us, to despair, weeping aloud like children, and neither of us attempting to offer consolation to the other. Such weakness can scarcely be conceived, and to those who have never been so similarly situated will, no doubt, appear unnatural. But it must be remembered that our intellects were so entirely disordered by the long course of privation and terror to which we had been subjected that we could not justly be considered at that period in the light of rational beings. And subsequent perils, nearly as great, if not greater, I bore up with fortitude against all the evils of my situation. And Peters, it will be seen, evinced a stoical philosophy nearly as incredible as his present childlike supineness and imbecility. The mental condition made the difference." And part of the reason I read that is there's an intense psychological component to this. It's not simply that they have this sort of adventure and things go awry. Their level of ability to deal with the situation starts to deteriorate as their condition deteriorates. And there's a certain level of sophistication to that. You start out as one thing and you're hungry and you're beat up and and suddenly you're screwing up, you're making mistakes, you could have clearly done something that seems easy on the page, and that makes their situation worse. And that was one of the elements I thought was quite realistic about as an adventure story. You know, the confusion and the brain fog and all of that was really kind of interestingly done. They do get picked up by another crew and another ship, and Pime gets integrated into that crew. He becomes sort of rises in the ranks in this other crew. They end up going in pursuit of the Aurora Islands, which is a phantom island. I mean, it's got a Wikipedia page. This is an island that has been discovered like 4 or 5 times, and yet nobody seems to know where it is. So there's this phenomena in sea lore about islands that can't be reliably found. They're supposed to be in a place, but when you go there, they're not there. And then the next time somebody goes there, they are there. This is a real one that they went in search of.
Well, that's periodically the giant turtle that the world rests on will lift up a little bit and they'll sink back down. Yeah.
They didn't have the science.
We've known that since the 80s.
Right. Now when he gets to Antarctica and they encounter there's a civilization down there, fairly primitive civilization. Poe does a pretty amazing job of sort of building the world down there. It's got all these significances of color. Everything is black. Like the hills are soapstone. The people are black. Their clothing are black. Everything is black. And yet and then the emergence of this one animal that happens to be white freaks out this entire tribe. Like there's just these cool little things that he has come up with that are indicate that he's read deeply about accounts of like, when Europeans encountered tribes in the Western Hemisphere. Like he knew how that exchange worked historically, and he conveys that really well. But then also the actual world itself is different than ours. And I want to read this one little bit. This is I think this is the last bit I'm going to read from this. I was thrilled. I think I tweeted that it's been a long time since I had this much fun reading. I just really enjoyed it. It's rollicking.
Wow, you found this is great. Brad found the novel from Poe that he's really into.
Yeah, I
I'm
dig it.
enjoying watching you enjoy this.
Yeah. Now, this bit, I want you to think about Lovecraft as I'm reading this. This is when they're in Antarctica and they go ashore and they're walking through this world. Quote, "At every step we took inland, the conviction forced itself upon us that we were in a country differing essentially from any hitherto visited by civilized men. We saw nothing which we had been formerly conversant. The trees resembled no growth of either the torrid, the temperate, or the northern frigid zones, and were altogether unlike those of the lower southern latitudes we had already traversed. The very rocks were novel in their mass, their color, and their stratification, and the streams themselves, utterly incredible as it may appear, had so little in common with those of other climates that we were scrupulous of tasting them, and indeed had difficulty in bringing ourselves to believe that their qualities were purely those of nature. At a small brook which crossed our path, the first we had reached, Too-Wit is the name of the chief of this tribe, Too-Wit and his attendants halted to drink. On account of the singular character of the water, we refused to taste it, supposing it to be polluted, and it was not until some time afterward we came to understand that such was the appearance of the streams throughout the whole group. I am at a loss to give a distinct idea of the nature of this liquid and cannot do so without many words. Although it flowed with rapidity in all declivities where common water would do so, yet never, except when falling in a cascade, had it the customary appearance of limpidity. It was nevertheless, in point of fact, as perfectly limpid as any limestone water in existence, the difference being only in appearance. At first sight, and especially in cases where little declivity was found, it bore resemblance as regards consistency to a thick infusion of gum arabic in common water. But this was only the least remarkable of its extraordinary qualities. It was not colorless, nor was it of any one uniform color, presenting to the eyes as it flowed every possible shade of purple, like the hues of a changeable silk. This variation in shade was produced in a manner which excited as profound astonishment in the minds of our party as the mirror had done in the case of Too-Wit." So he does this great thing where they'd shown a mirror to the tribesmen, and it had blown their minds. And then they encounter this water in the land and it blows their mind. So you've got this sort of like exchange. It's very cool. It's very fun. I definitely recommend it. I'm not going to give away the ending, except to say it is among the most abrupt endings of any novel I have ever read. It's sort of like, it's more like a short story ending. So for people who maybe haven't, considered how novel, the difference in, the way that structurally a short story isn't just a short novel. A short story, you can kind of get away with ending on sort of a resonant image or note, just sort of like, and you kind of throw the things in the air and they don't have to come down. A novel, you can do that, but typically there's a more encapsulated, the narrative is more encapsulated. And Poe is just sort of like, and then the next thing happened, end. It's like, it's just over. And I think he never written a novel before. He never wrote another one after this. I think his form, and even this, it's all very episodic. I was stuck in the hold. The pirates attacked. We killed the pirates. We ate each other. Like, it's all, and every one of them is great, but it's not necessarily the most strongly tied together. So, anyway, I think that's here's another interesting thing about the Gordon Pine stuff. People believed it was true. Let me read just a little bit about that. This happens like 4 or 5 times in Poe's career. He writes some insane story and people people are convinced that it's real.
Too much detail.
Yeah, right.
Too well written not to
Yeah.
be real. Interesting. Yeah.
Quote, even readers as sophisticated as the American publisher George Putnam were at first taken in by Poe's artful documentary effects and believed the narrative was a genuine travel book and a serious contribution to geographical science. As Putnam told his English co-publisher, alluding to the hieroglyphics that Poe had lifted from a traveler's book on Petra in the Jordanian desert. That's right. He shows hieroglyphics in the book that he has sketched out. Quote, this man has reached a higher latitude than any European navigator. Let us reprint this for the benefit of Mr. Bull, which that's like Joe Sixpack. Putnam later realized that the grave particularity of the title and of the narrative misled many of the critics as well as himself. He was amused to note that whole columns of these new discoveries, including the hieroglyphics found on the rocks, were copied by many of the English country papers as sober historical truth. So people bought
that
it.
Is very cool. And so, I mean, it's almost like a War of the Worlds type thing, but a little more of a slow burn.
It is. Yeah.
This novel being taken as real information.
And part of it is the way it's set up in the opening. It's Edgar Allan Poe talking, and he's basically like, I have been written a letter by this guy, Gordon Pyme. He tells me this story, and I'm going to do my best to present it to you, faithful reader.
So he leaned into that.
He did lean into it for sure. I'm going to take a quick restroom break.
Absolutely. Brad has to take a restroom break.
Tell us
Yep, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, tell us about Blood Meridian Book Club and whatever else comes to mind.
Absolutely. Yeah. Brad, go take the restroom break. Yeah, we've got the Blood Meridian Book Club special coming up with the great Aaron Gwynn on Patreon in December. So if you want to get access to that, you got to go to patreon.com/artofdarkpod. We are going to do a live Zoom session like we do for all of the book club meetings that we do. If you want to attend, you can join. There's going to be a Q&A, a back and forth. If you're not comfortable joining, it's not your thing, you'll be able to listen back to that after the fact. And that, again, is for Patreon. I think it's December 3rd. I want to confirm. The details are at artofdarkpod.com. If you scroll down there is a bookends AOD Readers Club link and the schedule. Yeah, December 3rd. And we'll share that information with the patrons as we get closer to that. If you are not reading Blood Meridian yet, now would be a great time to start. You've still got, a full month here. And listen, if you're listening to this in the distant future, because these episodes are evergreen, right? Like Edgar Allan Poe's life is not going to change. It's still a good time to read Blood Meridian or reread it. And then, like I mentioned, we have the Beckett Darkroom episode coming up. I'm prepping some pretty exciting episodes. I've got Shelley that's coming up. So we're going to be talking about monsters and Frankenstein and young authors making an outsized influence. Pretty incredible.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And just the Patreon pitch is that we hope you support the pod. We put a lot of effort into these episodes, especially the core episodes. Everybody who listens to this podcast, is already a supporter just by listening, as far as I'm concerned. We really appreciate it. We love doing this show. We want to do it for a good long time. If you want to materially support the show, the very best way to do it is patreon.com/artofdarkpod. You can also go to the website, artofdarkpod.com, and there is a PayPal link. We are trying to work our way up the rank, and we are trying to do more cool things generally, but also for patrons. It's a lot of fun to do this show. It means a lot to us. We love hearing from listeners in pretty much any format. Telegram, t.me/artofdarkpod. I said the email earlier, artofdarkpod@gmail.com. Brad mans the Twitter. That's at artofdarkpod. You can find us on Patreon too, where there's a chat room there now. I manage that. It's a really good time. We've got a nice division of labor here. Yeah. Brad takes a core episode. I take a core episode. We've got, we both kind of book guests, although Brad kind of takes the lead there. But I've increasingly been thinking, okay, who else can I get on to talk about so-and-so?
Yeah,
we do so many.
we're always on the hunt for good guests.
Yeah, always
Yeah.
on the hunt for interesting guests, people who can talk for 60 to 90 minutes about one of the core subjects we've covered. And just love doing this show. Love our listeners. Love the Telegram chat room that we've got. The vibes are immaculate. And please, wherever you find your podcast, enjoy it. Share these episodes with your friends, your family. If you know somebody, this spooky season, or again, and really any old time, who might want to hear about Edgar Allan Poe, and in 4x hours, however long this is going to go, get kind of the comprehensive overview. We hope that this is valuable for people. So
Indeed.
Good stuff. How was your bathroom? Are you feeling refreshed?
I feel refreshed. I feel rested.
Yeah.
I'm ready to go.
Your teeth didn't fall out of your face?
Well, one or two, but they grow back.
Don't worry. The witch that lives in your backyard will be there to collect them later, Brad.
Oh, good.
Yeah, she's it's the witch of the literary it girls past.
Indeed. So we're entering Poe's last decade here. He's Gordon Pym didn't work out. He has a stretch where he's not doing any editorial work. He's getting some things published, but it's really not enough to live on, to be honest. And what does he make up with the shortfall? Mostly begging money from anybody he can get a buck from. He does at one point take on a job that causes some serious problems for him. And the setup is this. Harper's had put out a very expensive book on conchology. That is conches, seashells, and that sort of thing, right? And it was a big, expensive, hardbound, beautifully illustrated version. And Poe was approached by another publisher who said, you know what? I bet we could make some money if we made an inexpensive version of this, right?
Oh.
And so Poe needs the money. He gets paid at the time $50 to crank out an inexpensive version of Harper's Conchology. He does so, and basically he writes a very pretentious introduction that is off-putting for some people. He lifts large segments of it, apparently or supposedly, or is accused of, from the Harper's version.
So he does the thing that he hates.
He's accused of plagiarism and probably did kind of plagiarize, though he would say that I think technically it was more like copyright violation because he was citing them, but he was citing large passages, large swaths, right? So plagiarism is maybe not exactly the right word, but in spirit, it's fundamentally the same. He's filling space with other people's work. And then here's the killer. Here's the killer. He makes only $50. Here's the two killers. It would be the only book of Poe's reprinted in his own lifetime. He put his own name on it. He shouldn't have he should have did the Alan Smithy thing, right? Just come up with a name and slap it on there. And then Harper's was pretty upset about this. They'd been undercut. So when he went to Harper's with his next book, they just laughed him out of the room. They're like, no, we're not going to publish this thing. What are you talking about? Like you're the enemy. We're not, so
you're the conch man.
Yeah. So with this,
get out of here.
He makes $50, which I think is like $1,500 or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And he torpedoes his career and tarnishes his reputation. But he needed the money, right? He didn't want to write a book on conchology. So anyway, he does get a job at Burton's.
Conchology. That sounds like a Lost Prince album,
right? Doesn't it? Right.
It's like the Lost Prince B-sides,
right? Conchology. I like it. He gets a job at this magazine, Burton's. He's paid about $10 a week. He's told at first that it will only take 2 hours a day of his time, which that's not bad. It's like a part-time job. Turns out to be a lot more than that. He's responsible for basically every aspect of the magazine, from proofing to overseeing the actual printing, the whole shebang. And it wasn't really enough money to even he couldn't make ends meet with it. So even with this job, he's still sending out letters begging, by the end of 1839, begging friends and whoever he can to try and send him a few bucks. However, he does have now an avenue for his own writing. Again, he's the editor of Burton's. He can put his own thing in there. The Fall of the House of Usher comes out during this time in Burton's. He puts it in his own magazine, which there's this the thing that writers we tend to do is we sort of sit around waiting for somebody to publish us. Right? Like, oh, well, what if I put my name in the hat and I'm in a slush pile and I'm in 50 slush piles, and there is something to like, well, just make something happen, right?
You
One way or
kind
another.
of have to. Yeah, there are different approaches to this.
Yeah,
some of them, politically I might reject or oppose, but if it works, it works.
Yeah. So we talked about the Fall of the House of Ushers, House of Usher. It does manage to convince a publishing house in 1839, based on the strength of the Fall of the House of Usher, to come out with a 2-volume collection of his short stories entitled Tales of the Grotesque and the Arabesque, which is that's a very pulpy, you know what I mean?
I like that title.
That's good. This includes 25 stories. It gets mixed reviews. It does have this story, The Man Who Was Used Up, which I love. This is one of my, if I'm doing a ranking, which I hate ranking, this goes on my top 5 maybe of Poe short stories. Not The Man Who Was Used Up. Another one, The Man of the Crowd. The Man Who Was Used Up is good too, but The Man of the Crowd is amazing. I'll give you a quick breakdown. Basically, what you've got, there's a guy sitting there in London, and the street is just choked with pedestrians. And he's sitting there and he's categorizing everybody. That's a clerk, that's a housemaid, that's a carpenter, that's a that guy works in a factory, that's a newsboy, that's a chimney sweep, all of the different roles in society. And he's just putting them, and all the different kinds of clerks, right? Old ones, young ones, fat ones, whatever. And then an old man walks by that he cannot figure out where this old man goes. He doesn't fit any slot that he can come up with. And so our narrator starts to follow him, and he follows him all night. And the old man doesn't seem to even notice him. He'll get right up next to him, and the old man doesn't see him. And he follows him all through the night. And the guy's just walking in just circuitous routes in London. He's never stopping anywhere. He follows him all night into the next day and into the next night. He's following this old man, and it gets creepy. Like where's the old man going? Why can't our narrator stop following him? Why can't he just break off? He has this obsessive thing, and there's this sort of Kafka-esque kind of turn where the narrator stands right in front of him and the guy still doesn't notice him. Let me just read you a quick little bit from this story. I highly recommend it, because what you're seeing is a quintessential modernist short story written in 1840, well before anybody else was really playing this game.
That is remarkable.
Right. Yeah. It's got the urban element, the everything about it. So just there we go. This is just the last little bit. Quote, "The sun rose while we proceeded, and when we had once again reached that most thronged mart of the populous town, the street of the D Hotel, it presented an appearance of human bustle and activity scarcely inferior to what I had seen on the evening before. And here, long amid the momentary confusion, did I persist in my pursuit of the stranger. But as usual, he walked to and fro, and during the day did not pass from out the turmoil of that street. And as the shades of the second evening came on, I grew wearied unto death, and stopping fully in front of the wanderer, gazed at him steadfastly in the face. He noticed me not, but resumed his solemn walk, while I, ceasing to follow, remained absorbed in contemplation. This old man, I said at length, is the type and the genius of deep crime. He refuses to be alone. He is the man of the crowd. It will be in vain to follow, for I shall learn no more of him nor of his deeds. The worst heart of the world is a grosser book than the Hortulus Animae." And perhaps it is but one of the great mercies of God that lasst sich nicht lassen. Which I don't know what that means. I should look that up.
Is it auf Deutsch?
Well, last Nicht. That's a German word,
Nicht.
right?
Yeah.
Nicht.
Yeah.
Lasst sich nicht.
Lasst sich nicht. Yeah. What? Lesen, right?
Lasst.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let me translate it just so I get it
quick
accurate.
translate.
It cannot be read.
It cannot be read.
Well, because it needs a lesen at the end. Es lest nicht.
Oh, I'm sorry. It does have a lesen at the last line.
Yeah.
I did see it there. Yep.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's lässt sich. My German is crummy. Lässt sich nicht lesen. It cannot be read.
Wonderful.
Or he cannot read it. Really.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Fun.
So great short story. If you're looking for a Poe that isn't like the typical Pit and Pendulum, Telltale Heart horror stories, which I love those stories too. But if you're looking for a slightly different one, The Man of the Crowd, short read, magnifique. Now, Burton, Poe is working at Burton's, as we said, and then he gets fired again. He gets fired for boozing. Fundamentally, he's falling down in the job. Now, he very quickly turns this around and starts working for Graham's magazine. This is in 1841. This is another magazine, right? This Graham is the name of a former cabinet maker and lawyer who basically what happened is he bought Burton's. Poe had been fired from Burton's. This Graham guy comes along. He had a magazine. He bought Burton's. He put it together with his magazine and he hired Poe. And so now suddenly there's a distribution of 5,000. The Graham's is a distribution of 5,000. Poe is given the position of editor. He's paid $800 a year. It's the most money it might be the most money he ever makes as a wage. $800 a year in those days dollars. And he has an assistant now, so he doesn't have to do he doesn't have to like arrange the type. He can like literally be an editor, managing the content of what's going to be in this magazine. And Poe's run at Graham's makes Graham a very wealthy man. Poe does not become wealthy.
That's why you gotta structure your contracts properly, people.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. There was a thing where I think there were, other than Graham, I think there were 5 employees of the magazine. The profit was $25,000 a year when Poe left. He was the editor and he was making $800 a year.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know. Yeah. I don't know what those numbers should be, but you could have doubled what you were paying Poe and nobody would have noticed. Yeah.
Maybe this has something to do with that boom and bust cycle we noticed earlier.
Could be
somehow. I wonder.
Now there's something very I'm trying to get us through this. There's something very essential that Poe does at Graham's. He invents the detective story. There's basically 0 detective stories before Poe writes The Murders at Rue Morgue. They don't exist. Some people have said there weren't even really detectives before The Murders at Rue Morgue.
I wouldn't even know where to find this detective. I would need a detective to find a detective story. Yes. That's a good idea.
Yeah. Right.
Okay. So he invents the detective. I think I vaguely maybe knew this, but
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's 3 stories that feature this character, Auguste Dupin. French sort of freelance detective. He's an expert in ratiocination, right? He can analyze any situation and break it down to exactly what happened. He can take what seem to be disparate and separate details and weave a rational narrative that connects the two of them. He's also very eccentric. He's sometimes irascible. He's sometimes condescending, plays by his own rules. He may remind people of some other famous literary character, Sherlock Holmes, who is a directly derived from Auguste Dupin. Like Arthur Conan Doyle doesn't even try to hide it. He's like it's practically the same character. So Poe basically invented Sherlock Holmes. But not only you have to think, not only Sherlock Holmes, think of the tropes. How many detective stories are there when you get the loose cannon cop or private detectives who's extremely talented but very eccentric and hard to deal with, right? It's literally there's Columbo, like there's dozens and dozens and dozens of these.
We always talk about True Detective season 1.
Yeah.
It's right there. Yeah.
It's a little bit in True Detective, right? It's everywhere, and Poe basically creates this trope, which just I think is fascinating.
It's pretty major. Mm-hmm.
It is. He invented and this is the thing. If that was all he did, he also pioneered in Gothic horror. He's a pioneer in science fiction, and now he invents this whole subgenre. There is this cool thing, and so there's 3 stories: the murders at Rue Morgue, where he solves this puzzle that ends up that an orangutan killed this woman. Because they can't
likes
figure
them orangutans.
Yeah, they can't figure it out. It's like it had to have been somebody extremely strong. And then
what's the motive?
Right. Yeah. Well, it was just apparently it had gotten loose from a zoo or something. But it's interesting to watch Dupin go through how he's tracing these things together. And the other thing is Dupin is so rational that it's like it borders on being able to read minds. Like he can, based on how you're acting, he can like tell you what you're thinking, right? And on more than one occasion, he sort of miraculously is able to pull off this feat, right?
Press X to doubt.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Let me read a little bit from I think this is from D.H. Lawrence, I believe. Yes. Or from is a little bit about Poe and murder as a crime, as an act, and a little bit about, well, just some of the things that seem to be going on in the works of Poe. Quote, in The Murders in the Rue Morgue and another story, The Gold Bug, we have those mechanical tales where the interest lies in the following out of a subtle chain of cause and effect. The interest is scientific rather than artistic, a study in psychological relations. The fascination of murder itself is curious. Murder is not just killing. Murder is a lust to get at the very quick of life itself and kill it. Hence the stealth and the frequent morbid dismemberment of the corpse, the attempt to get at the very quick of the murdered being, to kind the quick and to possess it. It is curious that the 2 men fascinated by the art of murder, though in different ways, should have been De Quincey and Poe. Thomas De Quincey, Confessions of an English Opium Eater, highly influential on Poe. Men so different in way of life, yet perhaps not so widely different in nature. In each of them is traceable that strange lust for extreme love and extreme hate, possession by mystic violence of the other soul, or violent deathly surrender of the soul and the self, and absence of manly virtue which stands alone and accepts limits. Okay, there's a little interesting thought about, I think it's easy to, there is a certain, in some ways, we have to reckon with the appeal of stories about murder. Like, they're popular. They always have been, and they always will be, right? They're maybe more popular than they've ever been right now, and so, the question is like, is that just a simple sort of facile, like, fascination we have, or does it actually speak to something deeper about our relationship to life? And
it speaks to something deeper because we're the only animal that can murder, really. Mm-hmm. Certainly at the scale that we do. I'm sure somebody with a fedora would want to come in and say, but the monkeys, the chimps do it for blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. But as far as we know, we're the only animals that are capable of doing that. The ability to murder is sort of what makes us human. In a sense. And, there's, I'm getting ready to go see that Tool show, the Tool song Vicarious. you want to get really gnarly, it's sort of like, why are we entertained by this?
Right.
Why do you go into a workshop and it goes, oh, raise the stakes, raise the stakes. You know, why am I watching? And it's like, well, a murder will immediately grab your attention.
Yeah.
It's primal, but it's
Yeah.
also extraordinarily human. And
Yeah.
there's a quality of well, they say in that song, much better you than I. There's a little bit of like, if I'm here watching it, I can observe it and I'm safe from it. So it's titillating. It's almost pornographic in a way. I mean, there's a whole genre of murder porn.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And we're going to talk about Killers of the Flower Moon a little more when we get to the Patreon, the After Dark. But at the end of that, this is no spoilers, but like, it's a true crime story. And true crime is, aside from like comedy, it's the most popular genre of podcasts.
Yeah, it is.
People love a murder story. So what do you think it is, Brad? I've got lots of theories about it.
Well,
but, yeah.
I think you're hitting a lot of the notes. I think this D.H. Lawrence bit was too. I think there's something very evolutionary about it too. There's something about observing a murder, because our brains are always looking to how to solve problems that could happen to us too. Like, that's part of the reason we gossip, I think, is we're sort of like, did you hear what he did? That was really, or did you hear what she did? And like, your brain is logging this as information to like not do that, not step over there, not interact with this, whatever. It's using it as survival. And so you see a murder and it's instantly fascinating, because it's like, that is a problem that I want to avoid as much as I possibly can. And so it's like magnetic.
That's so interesting, because for me, it's always been like, ooh, what if I have to do that one day?
There's that too.
I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. But I think on some subconscious level, there might be a little bit of that for people.
Well, and you think, this is another sort of subgenre of these sort of true crime movies, is the story that's not, it's not like a murderer, like somebody who sets out to murder. It's somebody who, for whatever reason, a fairly innocuous or sort of medium level of guilt event gets out of hand and somebody dies, right? That's a situation you could imagine, like you're driving on a road and you hit somebody and you're like, I'm not even drunk, but you know what? I had
a couple of beers and sure.
Right. Like, this would have happened if I was sober, but the courts, and those situations are very unnerving.
I was swiping on my Bumble match, and I didn't see the tricycle.
Yeah.
What can I say?
Right. And I think it's significant to note too that one of the first stories in the Bible is a murder. It's very early, right? I mean,
the most important story in the Bible is a murder.
It is,
in a sense. So, it's at the heart of what makes us human. Yeah,
right. Yeah. And so I think Poe is when he gets to murders is masterful at depicting the sort of psychological intricacies of these. And I think it's easy now we can kind of mock the popularity of true crime, but it clearly speaks to something. Just
it meets some primal human need.
Yeah, it really does.
Yeah.
Now, 1841, Poe meets a guy named Rufus Griswold. Rufus Griswold is kind of a hack writer who gets a lot of power in the literati because he puts together a popular anthology. He's not apparently that great of a writer on his own. Poe has a very rivalrous relationship with him. And I'm just putting that name out there, so when Rufus Griswold comes back around near the end, you know that he's known him for a number of years. Now, 1841, something else significant happens. Virginia Clem begins to die. She gets tuberculosis, 1842, January 20th, 1842. While singing and playing the piano, she broke a blood vessel in her lungs and blood began to gush from her mouth.
Ooh.
So I don't know if you remember, there was an excerpt I read earlier when we were describing Virginia, and then we were describing Poe and Virginia at home. modest circumstances, but Poe's being very convivial and friendly to guests, and maybe Virginia's playing a little on the piano and singing. And despite their poverty, it's a beautiful little moment that they're able to have together. In one of these instances, she just starts coughing up blood, and she's never well again for the rest of her life.
Banging out Rocket Man on the piano. Just goes so hard. I'm a Rocket Man. That is a scene. That's like something out of a play or a movie for sure.
Right. Yeah. Right. Now, not too long after, in 1842, same year of that, and Poe is there when this happens. The blood comes out and all of this. He writes The Mask of the Red Death. I don't know if you're familiar with this one, Kevin. The Mask.
Heard of it? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I probably read it ages ago. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is one of the first stories he writes after Virginia gets sick. And this is where we see a big shift in the tenor. We see some of the elements that have always been there getting emphasized in this story and in those to follow. It's a Mask of the Red Death is a sort of imaginary period piece set, hundreds of years ago. And basically what's happened is this wealthy Prince Prospero has locked, he and a bunch of his friends they've locked themselves up in the abbey and welded the doors shut to basically wait until this horrific plague dies down. And it's a plague where people are like bleeding from the pores of their skin. You die within like a half an hour of contracting it. It's like horrific. And they've locked themselves into this abbey.
At least it wasn't COVID, though.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
Oh. Woo! They really skated by there.
Yeah,
they need their vaccines. Okay, go
ahead. And so they're living in this very decadent environment. One thing that's cool that Poe does is he sets up each room in the Abbey is like, he tells you exactly how it's lit, and each room is like a different color. This is very striking. Like it's a cinematic kind of move. He's setting up these little set pieces that have these sort of poetic resonances.
I keep thinking about Kafka. Did Kafka read Poe? He must have.
I gotta think he did.
Yeah.
And
okay.
I kept thinking the same thing. Like these are sort of Kafka-esque setups where Kafka like sort of chops the end off of these almost or something, right? Like Poe settles into them making sense a little more than Kafka does, but they are of that same kind of vibe. Let me just anyway, I just think the Mask of the Red Death is significant, not only because it's a good story in and of itself, and it's worth reading, I think. I want to emphasize the shift in Poe's perspective and his creative interests after Virginia gets sick. You get the Mask of the Red Death, and then it might not be the next story, but a little bit later in the year, you get The Pit and the Pendulum. Interestingly, The Pit and the Pendulum, one of his most famous stories, comes out in a literary annual called The Gift, a Christmas and New Year's present for 1843. And it's a story, for people who don't know, it's a story set during the Spanish Inquisition, in which a prisoner, he just wakes up in this dark dungeon. He's trying to figure it out. He's trying to measure it out. Then he wakes up again. I can't remember if he gets poisoned or what, but anyway, he wakes up again and he's strapped to some kind of wooden frame. And there is a pendulum, a crescent-shaped blade about a foot long, swinging back and forth. And with every swing, it sort of inches closer to him. Right. And the horror of the story is the madness of just watching it every single inch, and the rhythm of it, right? And the impending. And after a while, you're going to know exactly how long this is going to take. And that's what the horror. And again, think about tuberculosis for people was often fatal. Very often fatal in the 1840s. Poe had lost his brother to tuberculosis. He had lost his mother. He had lost his foster mother, And who knows how many other people he knew that had died of tuberculosis. And now his young wife, who he was madly in love with, has tuberculosis. And so that pendulum is swinging. Now, here's where the part that people forget in the pit in the pendulum. He gets out. The guy gets out of his strapping. He manages to trick a mouse or a rat to come and nibble off how he's been strapped down and escape. And then as soon as he does that, the walls become red hot and start squeezing in on him. I think people forget.
That rocks.
It's like you just go out of one thing into another. Eventually he does get saved by the French army the very last second. But yeah, it's interesting. A few years later, we're going to get a story called The Black Cat. This is one that I think people don't know as a little less familiar with, but it's a striking story. I'm just going to read a little passage from it, and then we'll keep moving along. The Black Cat. This is so striking. Okay. So what he'd done, the Black Cat, the narrator, it's one of Poe's deranged narrators. They had a black cat, and the black cat, there's other things going on, but suffice to say that the narrator has, in a fit of rage, killed this cat. And this is immediately after that. Quote, "And now I was indeed wretched beyond the wretchedness of mere humanity, and a brute beast whose fellow I had contemptuously destroyed, a brute beast to work out for me, a man fashioned in the image of the high God, so much of insufferable woe. Alas, neither by day nor by night knew I the blessing of rest any more. During the former, the creature left me no moment alone, and in the latter I started hourly from dreams of unutterable fear to find the hot breath of the thing upon my face and its vast weight an incarnate nightmare that I had no power to shake off, incumbent eternally upon my heart. Beneath the presence of torments such as these, the feeble remnant of the good within me succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole intimates, the darkest and most evil of thoughts. The moodiness of my usual temper increased to hatred of all things and of all mankind, while from the sudden, frequent, and ungovernable outbursts of a fury to which I now blindly abandoned myself, my uncomplaining wife, alas, was the most usual and the most patient of sufferers. One day, she accompanied me upon some household errand into the cellar of the old building which our poverty compelled us to inhabit. The cat followed me down. Oh, yeah, he killed the cat and it came back. The cat came back the very next day. The cat followed me down the steep stairs and, nearly throwing me headlong, exacerbated me to madness. Uplifting an axe and forgetting in my wrath the childish dread which had hitherto stayed my hand, I aimed a blow at the animal, which of course would have proved instantly fatal had it descended as I wished. But this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife. Goaded by the interference into a rage more than demoniacal, I withdrew my arm from her grasp and buried the axe in her brain. She fell dead upon the spot without a groan. So we'll just say that there weren't a lot of people writing like that in Poe's day. Just incidental axe murders in cellars.
And if you could write this right now today,
yeah,
it would have like an elevated, unusual style, but it would be enough. It would be enough.
Dude, have you seen I'm sure you remember the first season of Fargo, the TV version of Fargo? Yeah. There's this and that going on. There's a lot going on, but the crux of the entire season is the main character at one point gets pushed too far into a corner and he just bops his wife in the face with a hammer and it kills her. Mm-hmm. It's just this moment of boom, now it's irrecoverable. You cross some line in a fraction of a second. It's all of that. Yeah. So, yeah. Anyway, and there's all this other hatred of humanity in here. Like Poe is going to a very dark place after Virginia gets sick, and we're going to see how deep it gets. But moving right along now. In reading Poe's biography, I think in terms of a writing career, I think we see a moment where he has, in some ways, made it. In terms of reputation, you can say made it as an artist. There's a lot of ways to say that you made it. I think, highly successful commercially might be one way. Another way might be respect of your peers, right? Somebody who you look up to turns around and says, "Hey, you got it." That's a version of making it. And in March of 1842, Poe meets Charles Dickens. He'd sent Charles Dickens a review of Barnaby Rudge, and Dickens thought very well of Poe and liked his review. And when they met in Philadelphia, Dickens promised to try and help Poe get published in England. Apparently nothing came of this, but Dickens was like, "I'm on your side, man. You're a good writer. I'll see if I can help." And in fact, after Poe was dead, Dickens another time came and toured America. He sought out Aunt Maria Clem, Poe's aunt, and gave her a reasonably sized donation to kind of help her keep body and soul together.
I'm sure she said, "What the Dickens?" Oh, it's
yes.
money.
Yeah.
Thank
you.
Yeah,
I'll take that.
Dickens.
I will take
yeah,
that.
I like money. Mm-hmm.
Now, around this time, too, in 1842, he became well known to Nathaniel Hawthorne. Poe at one time thought that Hawthorne was the most privately admired and publicly unappreciated man of genius in America, and they became known to each other. Poe became known to him. Something else Poe does in 1840s that's pretty interesting and maybe would be expected by some people and not by others. While contributing to Graham's, he starts doing this thing where he tells the reading audience to send in ciphers. Basically, a ciphers is a simple kind of code where there's some kind of substitution rule, and the trick to deciphering it is figuring out what the substitution rule is, and they can be fairly complicated. Poe would have the readership send these in, and he would solve them. And he wrote a bit about how to come up with ciphers and how to decipher. He was very, very fascinated with cryptography in general. And apparently he solved virtually all of them that the audience would send in. And at one point, he was giving away a yearly subscription if you could,
a little contest. Yeah. Trick Poe. That's fun.
Yeah, it is pretty fun. Yeah.
It's sort of activating. Yeah, he had his own little community. That's cool.
Yeah, that's cool. It's a cool move. And his writing on cryptography was used as like a fundamental. Cryptography hadn't been formalized as a at that time quite yet. There weren't like best practices, and his document secret writing informed the later, so he came up with encryption is what I'm trying to say, though that's a stretch.
Edgar Allan Poe is Satoshi. Bitcoin has been around since the 1840s.
It was just waiting on the technology.
It just wasn't in your computer yet.
Right. Exactly. This whole cryptography thing culminates in a story called The Gold Bug, which at its time was Poe's most popular story. It appeared in the Philadelphia Dollar newspaper, which had a circulation of 300,000, supposedly. Though for Poe, he only got paid $100. The story, The Gold Bug, it's worth a read. It has a very long stretch of Poe explaining how the main character, this guy, what the heck is his name? Anyway, the sort of main character of it, how he solved where this buried treasure was. And it goes on page after page of like decoding this like abstruse message. And to be frank, it's not the most interesting of the Poe stories. There is a character, and Poe didn't do this very often. There is a slave character who is very much like, how, what is that Disney movie, Song of the South? That's like banned.
Yeah, Song of the South. Yeah.
Jupiter from Poe's story, The Gold Bug. Like the Gold Bug is like Poe's Song of the South.
Just a caricature.
Yeah, a total caricature. And part of the reason it was popular was because people thought Jupiter was funny.
Hey,
Okay.
the people want what they want, Brad.
I'm just,
Yeah.
I'm telling you,
Hey,
this is cultural history podcast.
at least they're reading is what somebody would say now, or probably not. But in any case,
Yeah.
yeah, that's interesting. That's an odd story that would be his most popular. I find that interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And now he would have one much bigger hit than that when we're coming to it.
Okay, cool. It's got to be the Telltale Heart, right?
No.
Okay.
The Raven.
Right. Oh, the Raven, of course.
Yeah,
what am I thinking? Yeah.
Now
He's got a whole damn football team named after him.
He does.
Yeah. The Minnesota Vikings. We're getting into the fifth hour.
Yeah, we're getting there. Yeah,
Brad, thank you so much for doing this. I love doing these core episodes with you. The Darkroom episodes are fun too.
It's great.
This is awesome. Now everybody knows too. We're getting to the Raven, and I'm really excited for that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, April of 1842, Poe resigns from his job at Graham's. Graham's was the best job he ever had. Why does he resign? Well, frankly, this is part of the reason he resigns is he radically expanded the distribution of Graham's, and again, profits of $25,000 a year, Poe making $800 a year, and it's basically Poe's magazine, right? Like, and again, I don't know what the number should be, but it's a little hard to swallow when that's the disparity, right?
Let me buy in a partnership share.
Right.
Let me see some of the sweet greenbacks that I'm essentially making for you. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he said at one point, like, I would have rather, like, he could have given me a 5% stake in the company and paid me no salary, and I would have done better. Yeah. Right. Anyway, so that was part of it. Also, when Virginia had her hemorrhage, he had asked for a 2-month advance on his pay, like, get a doctor and take care of some stuff. I might need to take a minute off, yada, yada, yada. And Graham said no. So even
not liking this Graham guy. Yeah.
And he can't even give him a little help him out a little bit. Now he also was getting a little bit sick of getting pushed around. And then one day he returned from a brief illness, Poe did, probably boozing, but we don't know for sure, to find that another person was doing his job. So he just bounced. Poe was like, that's it. I'm done. This is ridiculous. Rufus Griswold, who we mentioned briefly earlier, and I just told you to remember his name. Rufus Griswold took over the job. And while Poe was making $800 and was a wild success, Rufus Griswold was paid $1,000 a year. So this Poe did not like Griswold, and this was another reason not to like him.
It's so funny. The name Rufus Griswold is just right out of central casting for a villain.
It really is. Yeah, it really is.
You don't hear the name Rufus much anymore, do you?
Barely ever. Yeah,
maybe barely ever. Yeah. It's got an interesting ring.
I don't think it's bad, really.
Yeah, I have a theory that one of the reasons we're having so few children as a species now is because we've stopped being able to come up with good names.
It could be. Yeah, could be.
Yeah. That's all. That's all.
Right.
It's not even a joke. It's a real theory.
It is funny though, like when you think about naming kids, like, because people had like Rufus as a name, but like, who is looking at their little kid and being like, we should name him Rufus?
There are family names and relatives, and it has special meaning. And then it is strange how names take on like a weird sour turn at a certain point.
But I feel like what we used to do was we would name an adult, and it's like they're just a kid, and eventually there'll be an adult named Carl. Whereas now we name a cute kid.
You don't think that people gave names to their children back in the day?
No, I think they did, but I think when they applied the name, they thought of them as an adult.
I see. I see.
Now it's like we give them a cute baby's name. We give them a cute little kid's name.
Yeah. I see. Okay. Well, this is riveting stuff, Brad. I'm sure I'm sure this is what everybody.
I should have saved this for the Patreon.
Yeah, this will. Yeah. Oh, yeah. You're really going to sell the Patreon now, Brad. Interesting, though. Very interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's got this nemesis Rufus, who's making more money than he is at a crummier outfit,
and took his job from him.
Took his job.
Right, basically, he took over his job, didn't steal it. Now, after he leaves Graham's, Poe gets the idea. He knows he has a friend who's friends with Robert Tyler, who's the son of President John Tyler. And so it gets in Poe's head through some letter of a friend of his that he can get basically a cushy government job working for the Philadelphia Custom House. He has to wait for the other customs, the customs official who's in the seat at the time to resign, and then they're going to open up a whole new run of jobs. And it seems like Poe probably would have got it, except, well, he got drunk, so he didn't get that job. And then a year later, he tried to go to Washington, D.C. to make his case to John Tyler directly, and he got drunk. And he didn't make it. So if you don't make your appointment with the president of the United States, that's not good. I don't mean to laugh, but it's just like, dude, pull it together for like,
you got to follow minutes, through,
man.
For real.
Yeah. Now, so he's getting poorer and poorer. As you can imagine, he doesn't have his job anymore. He does start doing the lecture circuit. He does, I think his first event was a talk in Philadelphia on the topic of poetry in America. Mostly he just bashed Rufus Griswold's poetry anthology. But people liked to hear him talk. And for the rest of his life, he would periodically give talks on or readings on one thing or another. Now, April 14, 1844, Poe moves to New York. He'd given a lecture there and it had gone well, and he decided, you know what, I probably should be in the center of New York literary society. One of the first bits of writing that he hits the shelves in these New York years is and again, I'm skipping over some stuff here. There's a whole adventure story about how they got an apartment in New York. He left her on the boat and went ashore to find lodging. It's all pretty insane. And they're poor. He's got to bring he's dragged Maria Clem all up and down the eastern seaboard, right? But one of the first pieces he publishes a story called The Balloon Hoax. It was published under the title The Balloon Hoax. So keep that in mind. Knowing, quote, the extravagant gullibility of the age, Poe tried to imagine improbable possibilities. On April 13th of 1844, he publishes this story, The Balloon Hoax, in the New York Sun. And it's about an impossible balloon crossing. Basically what happened is these guys they were going to do a hot air balloon over the English Channel, and they get caught up in a jet stream and they get blown all the way to the United States, super fast. It's going I think it takes them 3 days in the story. And this comes out in the New York Sun, this story. It's a fun little adventure story. It's the second balloon story of Poe's. He ends up having 3 balloon stories. And despite the fact of the story's title, people once again believed this was a real news story.
You wouldn't tell us it was a hoax if it was a hoax. Why? Maybe some lawyer made him say the balloon hoax. Because honey, get in here. I think that this story, the balloon hoax. What is that? What does hoax mean? Rufus, get in here. Hoax, the balloon hoax.
Yeah, people were pounding on the door of the New York Sun office trying to find out more about this record-breaking, phenomenal balloon crossing. It literally says in the title, this is not true.
And then the market crashed.
Right. Yeah, the panic of 1844 happened, right? Everybody invested all their money in balloons. The whole thing went topsy-turvy.
The Rufus balloon hoax panic. But I study an economic historian, so I pronounce it the Rufus Balloon Hoax.
Hoax.
And it just sent the market tumbling. We usually say the market popped. Yeah. All right.
I just think it's funny because like a lot of times you always hear like people are so I don't know, like I wonder if I feel like they're more gullible than we are now.
I think we're equally gullible, but in a different way.
That's probably
what
true.
are we?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, their minds would be blown, but like, what is happening? I mean, dude, how many bots are on Twitter? Like, how many real accounts?
Oh yeah. I'm definitely not saying I'm definitely not saying we're zero gullible. I just think like they may be even more gullible. They might have been even more gullible.
Possibly.
It seems like there's this thing that's like, if it's written down, even if it says it's a hoax, it's got to be true.
Yeah, right.
Like,
yeah.
Anyway, yeah. So okay. So in this time, he also in this 1844 time, he finishes the Dupin trilogy with the Purloined Letter. Very good story. Very much like a logical, like a Hitchcockian kind of like it only works because of these sequences of who knew what when about what. It was very well done, very concise, very tidy. He writes The Premature Burial, which expanded on people's fears of being buried alive. In the 19th century, people were terrified of being buried alive. I think this is commonly known now, but it was like a public fear that many, many people had. So he has that in Premature Burial, but he also has the Cask of Amontillado, in which a character walls up his enemy in basically his wine cellar. Telltale Heart comes a little bit later. Now, in February of 1845, Edgar Allan Poe publishes The Raven in the American Review. He publishes it under the name Quarles in reference to the English poet Francis Quarles. He was paid $9 at the time for the poem. And he said that he had deliberately tried to write something that would appeal to both popular and critical tastes. And it was an immediate sensation and surpassed in popularity any previous American poem. There was, and maybe never has been, frankly, a more popular poem than The Raven in America. So suddenly, after 9 months of living in kind of a hermetic experience, he'd written a couple things here and there. He'd traveled a little bit and done a couple speaking things. He was suddenly the lion of the New York literary scene. The Raven just changes overnight his reputation in New York. He has a biographical essay published about him in Graham's, which had, by the way, interestingly, Graham's, his old employer, had refused to publish The Raven. But when Graham found out how hard up Poe was, Graham gave him $15. So Poe made more off of the rejection by a friend than actually publishing this story to huge acclaim. Which is just one of these weird ironies, right? After the poem comes out, he gets into friendly correspondence with the poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who he had a very, very high opinion of, and who was deeply influenced by. And fairly quickly, a collection of Poe's poetry comes out, which doesn't sell quite as well as the American Review edition that has The Raven in it. Let's just read. We got to read a little bit of The Raven. Not the whole thing, but a little bit. It is, frankly, I didn't remember it that well, other than a couple of the kind of key phrases. It has, and we're going to talk briefly about what he's doing poetically. It is a special poem. It really is. It's something different than almost anything else. Okay, this is The Raven, part of The Raven. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. 'Tis some visitor, I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Only this, and nothing more. Ah, distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books' surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more." All right, let me skip to a little bit where it actually has the raven in it. But the raven sitting lonely on that so for people who don't know, he's haunted by these sounds. He opens the door. There's nothing there. A raven comes in, and he's all caught up. It's a manifestation or an objective correlative of this sorrow he has for a woman that he has lost. But the raven, sitting lonely on that placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, "Other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me as my hopes have flown before." Then the bird said, "Nevermore." Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, "Doubtless," said I, "what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster till the songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore, of never, nevermore." So it just goes on like that.
Yeah, it's a banger. For sure.
It really is, man.
Mm-hmm.
And when you read it aloud too, it takes over. There's so many rhythms going on at the same time. I mean, clearly there's this rhyme scheme. It's written in trochaic octameter for people who are interested in this thing. Trochaic basically means that the meter goes stressed, unstressed, and octameter means there are 8 of these pairs per line. Poe would claim that it was a mix of octameter, actalectic, heptameter, catalectic, and tetrameter catalectic, which probably was Poe boasting about the poem's complexity. It is fairly complicated in terms of meter and rhyme. It is fairly complicated. The rhyme scheme is generally A, B, C, B, 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 but he has a lot of internal rhyme and a number of alliterations that make it feel almost like slant rhyming. He was incredibly proud of this work, as he should have been. When it was at the printers, he told a friend that it was the greatest poem ever written. I love.
All right. Okay.
Hey, man,
yeah.
You know,
I don't know. There's no point being modest. I mean,
no,
what are you going to do?
Get him?
You gotta, if you believe, if you make something, you gotta promote it.
Yeah.
You know.
He said that, quote, "Nothing even remotely approaching this stanzaic combination has ever been attempted." Now, this isn't actually true. He borrowed a lot of some of the core ideas about the stanzaic combination from Elizabeth Barrett Browning, but nonetheless, it was much more complicated than the kind of poetry that was popular at the time. This is the other thing. For it to be a popular poem, it is unusually intricate in how it rhymes and how it feels and how it sounds. So in a way, it's not wrong. I don't know if other people have tried it, but he's put something out there that is kind of weird, rare gem. And immediately after it coming out, Poe is cock of the walk. Let's read a bit from this little biographical essay about him that came out right after this was published, right after the Raven was published. Quote, "Mr. Poe is at once the most discriminating, philosophical, and fearless critic upon imaginative works who has written in America. He seems sometimes to mistake his vial of prussic acid, for his inkstand. Mr. Poe has 2 of the prime qualities of genius, a faculty of rigorous yet minute analysis, and a wonderful fecundity of imagination." Seems very true. As a critic, Mr. Poe was aesthetically deficient. Unerring in his analysis of dictions, meters, and plots, he seemed wanting in the faculty of perceiving the profounder ethics of art. His criticisms are, however, distinguished for scientific precision and coherence of logic. They have the exactness and, at the same time, the coldness of mathematical demonstrations. Right? Here's a little bit about how he looked at this time, what it was like to be in his space. Quote, this is from a writer named, his last name's Lowell. What's his first name? John? Anyway, quote, he was small, or that is Poe. Poe was small, his complexion of what I should call a clammy white, fine, dark eyes and fine head, very broad at the temples, but receding sharply from the brows backwards. His manner was rather formal, even pompous. I found him a little tipsy, as if he were recovering from a fit of drunkenness, and with that over solemnity with which men in such cases try to convince you of their sobriety. I well remember, for it pained me, the anxious expression of his wife. Okay, so moving right along here. Sorry,
I was reading in the background that this shot him to superstardom,
Yes.
household name, and
Yes.
he even earned the nickname the Raven.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah,
and it played into his whole vibe. Like I'm saying, dark and clammy and beady eyes and kind of, like. And he reads. And then this is the thing: he was very good at reading aloud, right? And so you have to imagine, for a while, the hippest thing that could happen in New York City was for you to be at a party when this strange looking dude got up to read The Raven, like with intensity and like, you know what I mean? Like a certain strange dark magnetism. His shabby genteel clothes, right? Like there's just something.
Yeah, with the southern accent and
yeah. So it would have been very cool to be in the room for that. So Poe is a big deal. Unfortunately, it didn't bring him in hardly any money at all. He made $9 off of it at the time. And as soon as he gets pushed into the he's been kind of a name in Philadelphia and in Richmond in these smaller magazines. Now he's the literary lion of New York. And this immediately puts him under scrutiny. He gets he doesn't like the biographical essay on him, even though it's positive. Any negativity in there at all, he takes umbrage with. He starts accusing people of being plagiarists that he doesn't like, including the guy who just depicted him, James Russell Lowell. He ends up co-editing this magazine called the Broadway Journal, which is the most sophisticated of the magazines he's ever worked for. And in the Broadway Journal, he starts going after Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And for people who don't know, Longfellow is, and at the time certainly was, we've sort of forgotten his name to a certain extent. He was a hero of American letters. I mean, he wrote Hiawatha, which is like an attempt at a true American original epic story. He was a literary hero. You didn't speak ill of Longfellow. Poe had called Longfellow the best American poet just years before, but the thinking is that Poe started to resent Longfellow after he'd written The Raven. He's like, no, The Raven is the best. The Raven is the poem. This is what you should be reading. Forget this Longfellow guy. There's that. There's also the fact that Poe, again, long overworked, long underpaid, resented that Longfellow was married to a wealthy woman. So Longfellow didn't have to worry about money. Longfellow had a chair at Harvard. He had a secure reputation, and he had a tendency to moralize. And Poe didn't like moralizing in literature. He didn't think that's what literature, poetry, or stories were supposed to be about. So despite the fact that Poe had recognized Longfellow's talent, he became like the perfect enemy to Poe, right? And you can, in a sense, you can sort of understand why, because he's been suffering through all this. He's just gotten this huge validation, right? And then this asshole He sits at Harvard, doesn't do whatever he
Yeah,
wants.
he's the establishment. I'm the new kid on the block, and
Right.
I'm going to let him know what's what. And I've got lots of theories about what poetry is, and I've written the greatest poem of all time.
Right.
I'm going to come at you, bro. Yeah.
You can kind of, it makes sense. Yeah.
Mhm.
Now Longfellow never responded to anything Poe wrote about this.
That is the move. If you've got a chair at Harvard,
Yeah,
or whatever it is,
Yep.
You don't always have to bite back.
Yeah. Now here's what, because Longfellow outlived Poe, this is what Longfellow said about Poe. Quote, "What a melancholy death is that of Mr. Poe. Man so richly endowed with genius. I never knew him personally, but have always entertained a high appreciation of his powers as a prose writer and a poet. His prose is remarkably vigorous, direct, and yet affluent, and his verse has a particular charm of melody, an atmosphere of true poetry about it, which is very winning. The harshness of his criticisms I have never attributed to anything but the irritation of his sensitive nature, chafed by some indefinite sense of wrong." Okay. Now, Poe, if you're an artist and you can't make a bunch of money and you can't get an esteemed academic position and you can't get some huge major book deal and you can't get a massive patronage, what is the next best reward? Some might say the next best reward would be access to attractive women. Now, Poe was apparently, now that he'd written the Raven, attractive to a certain type of woman. The most prominent of these we're talking about nearing his end of his life is a woman named Frances Osgood, or Fanny. But he would have a number of other female friends who sometimes competed for his affections. Now remember, Virginia is alive still in 1845, 1846, but she is very, very ill. And so she doesn't attend literary events with him for the most part. She spends most of her time in bed, frankly. It's a sad, tragic thing, but he's out in literary society. He's out flirting, etc. Now, he, as we said, he has this tomahawk. He's this harsh critic. He is want to sort of blow things up occasionally. He has a speaking engagement at the Boston Lyceum that is roundly mocked in the newspapers. And it literally tarnishes his reputation. It's a speaking engagement that goes so poorly, like he loses a good chunk of the stock he had in people's eyes for writing the reputation.
He was probably hammered or something.
He might have been hammered. He read a part of Tamerlane, which is just not a good poem, and then a part of the Raven, and it was supposed to be about like the state of American poetry. It was just like not what anybody came for.
Man, just come out and read the Raven, play the hits.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Play Freebird, man.
Yeah. He read Tamerlane, and then he was drunk on champagne, and he basically mocked people for clapping at it, even because he'd written it when he was a teenager, even though they'd only clapped at it to be courteous to him. Right. So this is like this weird, not good. Now
the Bostonians are gonna love that.
Right. Now he had so he's working on the Broadway Journal. He starts having issues with some of the people that he works with. One of the guys decides he's going to try to buy out. There's a partnership that owns it. One of the guys decides he's going to, I think it's Briggs. Briggs decides he's going to buy out the Journal. But the other gentleman, might not have his name, the other gentleman pushes back, and Briggs ends up leaving. And so now it's Poe and this other guy have the Journal. And then this remaining owner sold the Broadway Journal to Poe for $50. Poe didn't have this money, but he managed to scrabble it together. He dreamt for a long time of having a journal of his own. Now it sort of falls into his lap. Despite having been a successful editor, he can't run a magazine. There's like the business owning aspect. The pressure is too much. He just literally cannot handle it. There is an interesting anecdote about Walt Whitman coming to visit him. So Walt Whitman, a young Walt Whitman, and Poe sat in Poe's Broadway Journal office at one point, and I just think that would have been interesting. That's two true American originals, you know. He just so anyway, Poe's trying to run this magazine. He just doesn't have any business ability. He couldn't keep the thing going. Let's see. The final straw of this was that after a drunken spree, Poe could not get the copy ready on time, and basically the thing just falls apart. So a reasonably successful magazine. I think they got out 2 issues before Poe just blew the whole thing up.
Uh-huh.
So we're getting close to the last bit of his life. In the ensuing years, the last year of his life, 1849, he made $275. And the last 3 years of his life were roughly about that. Remember, he was starving or almost starving on $800 a year. The last 3 years of his life, he's making somewhere around $200 to $300 a year.
And living in New York City.
Yeah. I mean, it's Sheesh. Not. And the question is, it's funny. I had this question. I was like, oh, well, how am I going to set up this next part? You know, he's making so little money. How did he survive? Well, the truth is he didn't. Right. It's literally, in my opinion, it's fundamentally poverty that kills him.
Coming to it, aren't we?
Yes, we are coming to it. So, okay. So within a year of The Raven, Poe had largely disgraced himself with his Boston Lyceum performance. We're going to talk more in the After Dark, patreon.com/artofdarkpod, about the final act that gets him booted out of the New York literati. He loses his magazine. There was a rumor going around, fomented by both Poe's numerous literary enemies and even some of the letters he wrote, that Poe was insane. Like, generally, like, it would not have been uncommon for people to just think that Poe was insane. He'd written The Raven. He'd written stories about mad killers. Perhaps he was one, or could be one, right? So he tries to distance himself somewhat from the New York scene, and he moves up to this dilapidated cottage in Fordham, way up north of the Bronx, past Yankee Stadium, for people who know any New York geography. Out there, just one last kind of cute anecdote. He befriends some Jesuits who from St. John's College, which would later become Fordham University. Poe said of them, they, quote, smoked, drank, and played cards like gentlemen, and never said a word about religion. So I like this. He's up there just like hanging out, just chilling with the Jesuits.
Based Jesuits.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, Poe kept stoking the fires of the New York literary scene. He'd been run out of it in shame, but he had a column for a while called The New York Literati, in which he basically wrote, it was basically a gossip column about, like, it'd be like writing a gossip column about, isn't there like
our podcast friends or whatever?
Something. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And he would,
it's not a bad idea.
Yeah. He would give out really harsh opinions about the literary merits of stuff. So it was a lot of like, and his book sucks. Like,
boy.
So this came out in something called Godey's Ladies Book. It's like a women's gossip magazine. His last remaining friends were pretty much all aligned against him at this point. He writes one of the ultimate, while caught up in a libel case, which we'll talk more about in the After Dark, he writes one of the ultimate stories of revenge, The Cask of Amontillado. Yeah.
It's all falling apart. I mean, and I also think there's probably an element of, I don't think he could handle fame.
No, I don't think so.
So he goes to New York.
It went right to his head.
Goes right to his head, goes to Boston, botches a speaking thing. He's an alcoholic. He can't hold it together. And there would have been no way for him to capitalize on this fame anyway.
Not really.
Not the way that he was.
I mean, he probably could, if he would have been enterprising and it would have been like, all right, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to tour the country reading The Raven.
Reading The Raven in one of my short stories or two.
Right. He probably could have done fairly well doing something like that. And it wouldn't have lasted forever, but you know, a year or something.
Do a year of that. Yeah.
But anyway, January of 1847, we get almost the final nail in the coffin. Virginia dies. She'd hardly had a good day since that day 5 years earlier when she had the hemorrhage. She was only 24 years old. Having no image of Virginia, Poe realized he had no painting or anything of her. He quickly commissioned a watercolor portrait. And if you look up Virginia Clem, the only image of her is that painting of her taken after her death. So,
looking it up now.
Yeah. So after she dies, he breaks down completely. I mean, he'd already torpedoed his career, but basically now he physically and psychologically starts to break down. In 1847, a woman who nursed him said that she believed he had a lesion on his brain. And it was also remarked that his pulse would beat 10 regular beats and then intermittent. He had a heart arrhythmia. Who knows how long he'd had this for, but he definitely had it now. Fanny Osgood, a woman, a writer, a woman who was a writer who'd had a flirtation with Poe, became the apple of Poe's eye. He'd had an earlier flirtation with her that Virginia actually encouraged, which was kind of interesting. I think Virginia was incapable of participating in social and possibly even the sexual part of a relationship, and she kind of encouraged Poe to flirt with this woman. She may have also been excited that Poe was attracting attention. Like, there is some suggestion that excited Virginia, the idea that her man was now suddenly this big deal that he was when the Raven was at its top. But Poe lost Fanny to Rufus Griswold. So there's another
Rufus.
Rufus is a son of a bitch.
But you know what?
Poe's a son of a bitch too.
Listen, you know what? As the old saying goes, when Rufus comes a calling, hide your daughters. you ever grow up? You ever grow up with that? You ever hear that?
No, I didn't. No.
We grew up in different parts of the country. You played euchre.
Yeah.
I played pinochle, and we hid our cousins from Rufus.
Now,
out in North Dakota in the 80s and the 90s.
Now, there's one big piece of writing I got to talk about, and I'm not going to go in depth on it, but Poe thought it was among the most important things that had ever been written. It's a book called, it's a 40,000 word prose poem essay called Eureka. I'll just give you a quick summary. Eureka is Poe's attempt at explaining the universe using his general proposition that, quote, because nothing was, therefore all things are. In Eureka, Poe discusses man's relationship to God and the universe, or as he offers at the beginning, I designed to speak of the physical, metaphysical, and mathematical, of the material and spiritual universe, of its essence, its origin, its creation, its present condition, and its destiny. Now, let me read a quick thing from the preface. It's just a few lines. To the few who love me and whom I love, to those who feel rather than to those who think, to the dreamers and those who put faith in dreams as in the only realities, I offer this book of truths, not in its character of truth teller, but for the beauty that abounds in its truth, constituting it true. To these I present the composition as an art product alone, let us say as a romance, or if I be not urging too lofty a claim, as a poem. Now, this thing bombed. Poe thought that they should print 50,000 copies of it, that might be sufficient, that it was going to change the world, that, like I said, it was one of the most important things that was ever written. It's basically nobody reads it now at all. It's completely overlooked. I think it's possible, I am kind of interested in, like, what is Poe's sort of cosmology, right? Like, there's a imaginable world where that's an interesting book. I think the problem is Poe was out of his mind when he wrote it. Like, it was, all the wheels had come off at this point. And he was arrogant, right? Like, to set out, I am going to write the most important book ever written. That is a surefire way to write a piece of doggerel, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So now, as we sort of alluded to, after Virginia died, Poe proposes to several women who all reject him. Marie Shrew, his nurse, Annie Richmond was a woman. She may have been married at one point. Annie Richmond wouldn't marry him because he was a drunk. Mary Shrew, his nurse, didn't want to marry him because she was his nurse. She'd seen how dark he was. Uh, After her rejection, Mary Shrew rejected her. Poe became belligerent and challenged a newspaper editor to a duel, which never happened. Annie Richmond was this woman who was younger than him, unsophisticated but attractive. She sort of fell for Poe, but Poe ended up trying to play her against this other woman, Sarah Helen Whitman. It didn't work out. Poe loses his mind and tries to kill himself with laudanum. And the reason he does it is because Annie Richmond had promised him that if he were to be on his deathbed, she would rush to his side. She doesn't. He comes out of this. She comes out of this laudanum haze. It ends the relationship. It ends the relationship with Annie Richmond. And 4 days later, Poe shows up blackout drunk at Sarah Helen Whitman's door in the middle of the night, trying to get her to marry him. Right. So just desperately flailing about for any woman who might be able to save him from falling into the abyss of his own despair for a minute. Right. And you got to feel for him. I mean, he's had it all, lost it all. Like you have to imagine how, like, he's already a man. I mean, the poor guy, he lost his both parents when he was 3. He got kicked around by this foster father. He should have had the biggest inheritance in the history of Virginia, and that didn't happen because, according to him, his foster father's an asshole. He's just as talented as Longfellow, but that guy's sitting in a chair at Harvard with a wealthy wife. His young wife has been coughing up blood for the last 5 years. It's a tough to be Edgar Allan Poe. Like, it's not it's like I said, you wouldn't trade your life for his, very, very few people would. He keeps writing in his final year. He writes a story called Malonia Tauta, which is a very prescient science fiction story we'll talk about in the After Dark. He writes Hop Frog, which we read at the very top of the episode. He writes some love poems, a sonnet for his Aunt Marie Clem. Now, in June of 1849, Poe traveled south, intending to lecture on a lecture tour starting in Richmond. He stops in Philadelphia on the way to Richmond, gets drunk, loses his briefcase, gets locked up in prison where he undergoes his first attack, supposedly, of delirium tremens, has visions of being boiled alive in a cauldron, visions of watching Aunt Maria torn to shreds. When he finally does come out of it, he gets off of all charges because somebody in the court recognized him as Edgar Allan Poe, the poet. And they send him on his way. But now he's more paranoid than ever. Something really cracked in his brain. He constantly thinks that people are out to get him. People are trying to kill him. It takes him 2 weeks to get down to Richmond, only to discover that his planned lecture was in the suitcase that he lost. Now, he spends a week in Richmond, and we have to remember he's sort of from Richmond, Virginia. He visits with his doting and kind of backward and somewhat deranged sister Rosalie. I think she was like mentally handicapped, but it's never laid out, his younger sister. Poe tries to hook up with his youthful love, Elmira Royster. This was the girl he was sort of engaged to as a teenager. He almost manages to pull this off, but it's just too problematic. Like, they both grown up. She was very religious. He wasn't religious at all. Her interests did not run to the literary. She had grown children who were against the marriage. She'd been left a bunch of money, and the extended family was concerned that he would try to get his hands on it. He starts drinking again down there. He actually briefly joins the Richmond chapter of the Sons of Temperance. As like a show to like
as a goof. Sure is.
Yeah. Now she might have married him. There are some suggestions that she might have married him. She later claimed that she went to him in late September. He stays in Richmond for weeks. She later claims that she went to tell him in late September of 1849 that she would marry him, but he had already left. Whether that's true or not, who knows? But he had left. He decided after some time in Richmond, though, that Poe did, that he was a Southern boy and he was going to go back to Richmond. But first, what he needed to do is he needed to kind of make a couple things happen. He wanted to go up to New York to get Aunt Maria put together once again to help her move down to Richmond. He's going to drag her back down to Richmond, right? Along the way, He stops off along the way from Richmond to Baltimore. He stops off for a few drinks. He arrives on September 28th. He supposedly meets some friends who insist that they have a sociable glass of whiskey. Supposedly, he hadn't had a drop to drink since he spent the night in Philadelphia, but there's conflicting stories about this. He spent the night in prison in Philadelphia. Whatever the case, between September 28th and October 3rd, 1849, no one has any idea what Poe was doing. It's a 5-day gap. He gets off the train, drinks with friends, and then on 5 days later, on Wednesday, October 3rd, a young printer found and recognized when he found him the great Edgar Allan Poe, semi-conscious, on the ground, some people say in the gutter, outside the Irish tavern Gunner's Hall. He was dressed in a cheap palm leaf hat, a secondhand coat of commonest alpaca, dingy and badly fitting pants. His shirt was, quote, sadly crumpled and soiled, and he wore no vest nor neckcloth. He was wearing someone else's clothes. Now I'm going to read. This is the last little bit I'm going to read from the bio because it summarizes all of this really, really well. There's a lot of mystery around this. We'll talk about that a little bit. I think people like to make it more of a mystery than it really is, to be honest. Like anytime there's unanswered questions, like people want to populate that with all kinds of stuff. I don't think it's really that mysterious, but nonetheless, let me read this little bit. So Poe didn't know. The printer asked Poe if he knew anybody locally who could help him, and Poe had called out for this guy named Snodgrass, who was a doctor and a writer, but also like a temperance activist. Okay. Snodgrass, quote, Snodgrass also noted that Poe's face was haggard, not to say bloated and unwashed, his hair unkempt, and his whole physique repulsive. As a strict temperance advocate, Snodgrass could not resist using this sad example of Poe to emphasize with clinical precision the evils of alcohol. Right, so he goes on about that for a while. Now they get him to a hospital. Quote, Poe was cared for there by John Moran, the resident physician. He was confined in a prison-like room with barred windows that resembled the grim cells, chambers, vaults, and tombs of Poe's most lurid stories, and placed in the turret of the building with the other alcoholic patients. According to Dr. Moran, quote, when brought to the hospital, Poe was unconscious of his condition, who brought him in or with whom he had been associating, and remained in that state for the next 10 hours. After that, he suffered the same hallucinations he had encountered in Philadelphia. He experienced a, quote, tremor of the limbs and at first a busy but not violent or active delirium, constant talking, and vacant converse with spectral and imaginary objects on the walls. His face was pale and his whole person drenched in perspiration. A little bit further down. He regains consciousness. He thought Virginia was still alive. He didn't know what happened to his clothes. Quote, Moran tried to convince him that he would recover, but horrified by his degradation, Poe exclaimed that, quote, the best thing his best friend could do would be to blow out his brains with a pistol. He at one point he calls out for somebody named Reynolds. People think that this is the author of a book he may have reviewed. And then let's see. When describing his last days, Moran attributed to Poe some uncharacteristic religious last words, supposedly spoken before the fever quote, the fever called living was conquered at last. This is Moran talking. Let's see. When I returned, I found him in a violent delirium, resisting the efforts of 2 nurses to keep him in bed. This state continued until Saturday evening. He was admitted on Wednesday, when he commenced calling for one Reynolds, which he did through the night up to 3 on Sunday morning. At this time, a very decided change began to affect him. Having become enfeebled from exertion, he became quiet and seemed to rest for a short time. Then, gently moving his head, he said, Lord, help my poor soul, and expired. So, right, October 5th, I believe, or is it October 8th of 1849? October 7th, 1849, Poe dies. Fairly mysterious consequences. There's been a lot of ink spilled about what was happening in that time. When he, those 3 or 5 days in which nobody knew where he was. Some people have said I mean, alcohol seems to have clearly been involved. Some people have said that he was the victim of something called cooping. I don't know if people have heard of this. It's this it's basically a form of electoral fraud where like press gangs will go around and sort of kidnap people and like force them to vote multiple times.
You're going to vote good and hard, and you're going to vote early and often.
Right. And this would explain why he was in different clothes, because you'd make him vote and then you come back, he'd change his clothes, you'd make him go vote again. And the idea is you'd get plied with alcohol or you'd get beaten to do it. I suppose that's possible. I don't think there's any way to really know. It was October 3rd was an election day, or one of those days in there was an election day. Some people have said that he may have had a head injury. I find that sort of unlikely because I think the doctors would have known there was a head injury. I mean, I guess not. You could have a closed head injury.
Yeah.
It seems sort of unlikely.
Is the sort of going idea that he died from like detox? He did like alcohol.
Yeah. See, I think there's that. Now, Jeffrey Myers claims that there's some evidence that Edgar Allan Poe is a diabetic, and alcohol can really screw with your insulin levels. And it's very possible that he went into insulin shock and a diabetic coma. I mean, to me, some of that's like medical nuance. I mean, I think however you cut it, he drank himself to death, I think. There is a suggestion, apparently, at one point in the 90s, there was a pathologist, and sometimes apparently like in medical, I don't know if they're doing this in medical journals or at conferences, pathologists like to play a little game where you get somebody's symptoms and then you have to say what they had. It's a sort of a professional game kind of, right?
Yeah. You've got a terrible case of Rufus syndrome. You keep interrupting women on the first date. This guy over here, he's got a terrible case of podcaster syndrome. He won't shut up.
Yeah. Now there's so in one of these cases, a doctor was given, a cardiologist was given Poe's symptoms, and he said that Poe had rabies. There's not much. I mean, I'm no doctor, so what do I know? Whatever the case, the man is dead. He's of course well remembered now by Baltimore. There's a statue. The football team is the Ravens or the Vikings. But in some ways, despite the celebration of at least some of his writing, it did take a while for Poe to be recognized. And this is the last thing I'm going to say. Part of the reason that Poe for a long time was not well respected in America, or well respected as he became, and part of the reason people thought he was insane, and frankly, he was kind of insane, but the reputation was that he was an opium addicted madman with violent tendencies. I don't think that's fair. I think he suffered from depression. He was an imaginative genius who could not suffer living in his head anymore. That's the way I take it. But part of the reason his reputation suffered so bad is Rufus Griswold became his literary executor, probably because his Aunt Maria Clem, who was still around, was looking for somebody in the literary world to take care of it. And she didn't understand.
No will.
She didn't understand all the nuances of the New York literary. She just knew Rufus Griswold as a guy. He has Poe's old job. Can he do it? And then Griswold wrote a scathing obituary that was printed and reprinted and reprinted. So anyway, that's literally, this guy extended it beyond the grave of the rivalry. And that is the story of Poe. Finally, thanks to Charles Baudelaire and so many other people who came to love the writings of Poe, he has been established. His reputation has been established in the appropriate place.
And at time of recording, the Baltimore Ravens football team are at the top of the AFC North with a schedule of 5-2. It's the 5-2 Baltimore Ravens.
Wow.
And I do have to say, it is very cool that we have a football team in America named after a poem.
That is pretty cool.
Yeah, that is cool.
Yeah. Agreed.
Banger. Thank you, Brad.
Ooh.
Core episode in the can. Lots of fun. I learned a lot. We had some laughs. Now we know what Rufus syndrome is. We also we got a new shirt.
Yeah.
We got new merch at some point. We're going to have to make become Wayward. I like that. I like that a lot. I think the episode's going to be called Edgar Allan Poe's Wayward Demons.
Okay. All right.
Does that work for you?
That's good with me. Yeah.
We're going to do more on the After Dark. You tease that in a
sir.
second. Every episode we do, Patreon people get a bonus episode. I imagine this one will go a little long. Those are usually 20, 30, 40 minutes. Patreon.com/Art of Dark Pod. I got to ask the closing question. Brad, what do you think EAP would be doing if he was alive today in his prime? What do you think?
I think he would have kept writing. I unfortunately think that, do you remember when we did the Lucy and Desi episode? And at one point, Lucy said about Desi, she said he was a very talented guy and a very lovely man, but he was a loser. And it was sort of like, well, what do you mean by that? And she's like, he just had to lose. He would not let himself win. And I think that's where you get with Poe. I think talent, he would have invented 4 more new genres. You know, he would have kept producing, and it never would have quite worked for him because he wouldn't let it.
But he'd be a genius and he'd produce works of genius, but it would never coalesce into a better life for him.
Yeah, it would never make him wealthy or even
just like a
broken, good standard of living. Yeah,
like a broken soul. And who can blame him for, you lose both your parents in in your youth like that. I mean, obviously we love a story of like an Annie. Hey, I overcome it. I'm an orphan and I overcame. Right. Here's one who he did, in a sense, he left us this magnificent work that influenced and continues to influence people. But there's just fundamentally a certain degree of pain that is almost impossible to overcome. What a story, Brad. Riveting. Our first orphan, great American author. We're going to come back on the After Dark. What are we going to talk about there?
We're going to talk about the story Malanta Tanta, Poe's most prescient and most unusual and most overlooked short story. And we're going to talk about the scandal that, there were a lot of reasons, but this was the straw that broke the camel's back, getting Poe effectively booted out of the New York literati.
Where can people hear that?
Patreon.com/Art of Dark Pod. We're
going to be back. Thank you all for listening. In the meantime, I got a really weird rash. This just pops up. So I think my Rufus syndrome is really starting.
That's not good.
I gotta
that's never good.
Gotta go get this checked.
Hope it's not rabies.
Nevermore.